find it. This is the problem of being in several places at one time. I want to just before we begin, there's a thing called a SAP, which is the Student Academic Partnership. It's due in today, at 12 midnight, so we still have time. If anyone is registered as a student here, I am happy to put you on a list to create the article press moment, where we can you can go through the books, and you know, we're going to be developing that press, and it's £1,000. Well, it's 100 hours, or £10 an hour. If you are interested, or you know somebody that's interested, and you can send me their stuff between 4 o'clock today, when the seminar's over with, and let's say 7 o'clock tonight, so that I don't have to work till the absolute deadline. Don't hold back. So, and if is anybody interested in doing it?
Can you say a bit more about the article press?
No, not really.
Okay. I mean,
I have said everything there is.
But no, in relation to the SAPS project.
Yeah, it is that what I understand the SAPS project to be, which is probably, you can help out on this if you know more than.
Sean's involved in terms of archivey stuff with SAPS.
Right.
The archive's being packed away, so there's a limited amount of archivey SAPS project there.
Yeah. So, oh, there he is. Hi, Barnaby. Why don't you sit at that end there if you can get through. Welcome to here.
Thank you.
Did you find parking?
Over Newham Street.
Oh, yeah, good.
Yeah, because if we were around here just 2 hours.
Oh, right. Okay, excellent. We'll introduce him. What I was going to say is that there is a view, which is to connect article press with online, and therefore have both print on demand and have their own books being reestablished. So since we've got council backing, i.e. they love us and they're not giving us any money at the moment, and I'm also going for a very large bid on this, but it's 50-50. What it really would entail is reading proposals that come in and deciding whether or not these books are worth publishing, and then reading the pieces that come in for each book. So for example, one of the books that's been approved is on photography and representation, and at the moment Grace is part of the network of people doing this, but it would be good to share that out. And it would also be involved with article press, will also be, I want to rethink what it means to have a press in this time period. And so what I'm trying to do is come up with, you know, like-minded individuals that have a sense of the level of what's going on, and to see if we could, how we can have both material press and a press that would be online, basically. And therefore there'd be exhibitions involved, there'd be workshops involved, not in terms of what is a press, but what would, let's say, if article press became something that encouraged certain themes to be developed. You know, so that would be part of it. So, and also I want the occasional papers from this, from CFAR to be published. So if you're interested, don't hold back. Okay, let me know. Okay, that's about it, really. That's that.
I'll send you my little.
Did you?
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
You can check it.
I will, okay, thanks. I've got yourself applying, you're applying, maybe you'd be applying, Luke is applying for virtual futures on the undergraduate, I mean on the MA level. And see, anybody who's PhD undergraduate. So, okay. Let us go around one more time. Sorry. And if you don't mind just reintroducing yourselves, we're playing around with video as per usual. So hopefully that will be okay for you. Let me just, is there anybody that has a problem with being on video? Oh, okay. Fine. Hannah sends her apologies as well. She's waiting for the tape. basically. Okay. And we have an update on that, right? It's going to be.
Yeah, well, it's going to be live streamed within the next 2 weeks. So these are just being filmed and they'll be podcast, but then everything else will be live.
And will that be on Moodle or something
It'll
else?
be through a link on iCity until the CFAR website's up and running, and then you can log in directly.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Let's just go around the room and reintroduce yourselves, in part for the for this animal here, and in part for all of us.
I'm Grace Williams, and I'm first year PhD, and I'm looking at, my working title is The Supernatural Sex, Women, and Magic and Mediumship, so looking at early pre-narrative cinema, photography, new media in relation to how women are represented as supernatural. I also have quite an interest with archives and how things are archived. I did a SAPS project last year that was based around creative interaction with archives, but just interested in how that can be utilised as something that kind of provides authentication to knowledge, or that people just accept what's presented through these certain kind of constructs as fact, and the problematics that kind of follow that.
You have a lot to say about the Romney-Obama campaigns. That man keeps changing. Yeah, anyway, yeah.
Okay, I'm Daniel, and not really sure what I said last week, but I think I'm working mostly around questions of representation, and I'm kind of using photography to look at the way representation operates, and it's not exactly right, because I guess what I'm, it will be more precise to say that I'm thinking about the difference between representation and frame. What does it mean to represent something or to frame something? And photography is interesting because it embodies both things. It boasts an image of an object, but it also, it always carries its frame with it, in a sense. So photography always has this aspect of it, which is facing its own means of production or its own coming into being, which is completely separate from what the image is about. So it's a little bit like what Lyotard says when he critiques Hegel, I think it's in the first chapter, when he critiques Hegel's logical approach to the now, when he says that the now is for Hegel is comprehended through language, but in fact there is something immediate and central in the now that can be apprehended only besides language. So that's almost, like trying to say that in photography there is always something of the now, and but what is of the now is not what is the image, but it is the frame of the image.
Very interesting. You're almost done. You can take him out and flog him later. He's hopefully going to do his violin march, so that's why he's knowing what he's doing.
Question.
What's that?
Can I answer a question?
Yeah.
Oh, that's because I was thinking also when you said the frame, did it say that relates to the figure form or the figure matrix or both? Depending on what kind. I was just thinking the figure form bit in the Lyotard is sort of one level.
I think the frame for me is a marker of repetition. Somehow, and I think you're right, I'm not entirely sure how exactly frame and repetition connect, but I know that there is a connection there. And it's almost like the frame is the signature of the technologies that make the image. The technology is written into the image in the frame. But by the frame, I don't mean the metal or wooden aperture so the picture is shown, but the way the image always delimited. It's always framed. You can't, if you take the frame away, you don't have any image. Then it just ain't nothing. So the frame is precisely the means by which the image came into being. But that is totally outside representation.
Okay, we're going to stop it at
Yeah.
that. We'll get into a conversation.
I'm Barnaby, and I'm interested in
Sailing.
Not sailing, yeah, Rod Stewart. I'm interested in George Bataille and the oralities that I perceive surround him. But in particular, at the moment, I'm concentrating on what I'd like to call pornographic superposition. and the cochlean vagina. And in particular, I'm interested in...
Your project changes a lot.
Well, that's why I don't speak
But
to
that's
you very,
good,
that's why I
that's
don't speak
good.
to you very often. 'Cause
Yeah,
otherwise
I
you'd
see
have
that.
all the changes.
That's right, that's excellent. This is a change since last week. That's
No,
okay.
no, it's just a slight expansion on what
Okay,
I
so the
what was.
cochlean vagina.
Yes, it's
Nothing.
it's the vagina as not as an object, but just as the possibility for an interior space, and I'd like to kind of conflate it with the cochlea, which is this sort of part of the ear, because I'd like to have it as a kind of receptacle for orality, or rather a place for orality, and I'd like to contrast it with the penis object, which doesn't have those attributes. But inside this interior only.
Wait, let me just stop you there. So this idea of the logos, phallocentral logos, you're getting rid of that. You're bringing in an irigere move. Is that what
Yes,
you're trying to say?
yes, yeah.
Okay.
And sort of, if you like, inserted into this vaginal space,
As it were, yeah.
as it were,
A better phrase.
yeah, is I think that there might be something in here, which is, I think it might possibly conform to the notion of a figure matrix, that it can be, if you like, because it has this this receptacle for orality, that it can be mapped by its enclosure, and that it can have these kind of matrix points which make things slightly more interesting. But it also represents, rather than a kind of space of liberation, it's a space of difficulty and somehow blockage. So I think I'm interested in teasing out something there. But yes, it's the space is an irrigine space. But what I'm interested is also bringing this notion of a kind of quantum superposition, which is an engendered notion, where two genders happen at the same place simultaneously, and not just two genders, but
I was going to say only two.
No, any number of genders happen at the same time, and not in a dialectical relation.
Okay, that's food for thought there. Yeah, sounds good.
I'm Mark, postdoc. At the minute, I think I'm interested in the travail. Is this the right pronunciation? The found object? Is this the right word?
Yeah.
That's kind of it, I think. Really. Just doing the reading
And what of the found object?
well, it's a different from that, I guess, between that and a created object. I think they might.
They mean like Duchamp's fountain?
Anything like anything that you come across in your travels and take fancy, and how it then speaks to you and opens up. So I'm just interested in trawling the places we might. The West Bank of, I don't know, I've never been there, the Seine or somewhere, the flea markets, like this kind of place. I don't know, something like that.
Have you come across Mark Dion's project with the Thames?
I haven't, no. It seems
He dredges the Thames, gets all the things he finds, from pipes to balls to detritus, and then
Yeah.
archives them. And they're quite obsessive, odd kind of way.
Yeah, so that kind of thing, yeah.
Interesting.
Kind of the preponderance of the object, I think, is that might
Nice.
be fine.
Hyperabundance.
The preponderance
Oh,
of
preponderance.
No, I know that you're suggesting hyperponderance, but
But no, preponderance, that sounds
I think as it changes subjectivity according to, like in a Magnia constellation, that's different from the subjectivity as it's constituted. So, not too much.
I'm Mattia. I'm starting a PhD now. Last week I spoke a lot and probably was quite confused because I was confused. I got a much clearer idea on the next morning, which I brought down so I can read it to you.
All right.
It's 3 lines, actually less. And the work I'm trying to do is about the emergence of sense as an event where language and meaning distribute each other reciprocally and simultaneously. That is, that there are only interior spaces, no outsides, and all these interior spaces are aesthetic spaces. They have technological specific or language specific or material specific possibilities and meaning.
So we're going to have vaginal aesthetics. That's what we're talking about now.
Today's
term.
And I think that this is particularly what happens in art, but it extends all the way to science, taking all other practices. And I use practice as a very important word because I really try to find a way to move away from the opposition, or even just the separation of practice and theory. I think that having something as a theory is not only introducing representation, but it's authoritarian and hierarchical, and it suffocates all possible heterogeneity of different.
So are you suggesting, well, I'm going to let that lie for a second, but are you suggesting that language is wholly different than event?
No, language is one of the events.
Okay, but I thought I heard you say that you were opposing language.
No, practice to theory. I don't like this idea of practice and theory.
Yeah, come on in.
Oh, hi.
No, hi.
Sorry.
No, you can join.
Oh, I was just when you're free, I'll come back.
Okay,
Yeah.
after 4.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. Sorry.
Vice versa, I think that what is called theory is in itself a practice. But
Yes.
it posits itself as theory, as a meta language that wants to explain the rest. And all the problems come from there.
Okay. Any questions, Matthew?
You talk about internal spaces and you say that there is no outside.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't quite understand it. I mean, how can you have internal spaces if there is no outside?
Well, there are spaces that expand in the event. They have their own qualities or dimensions. But they are not, and therefore their meaning is just installed by the distribution that takes place in that event. In that sense, they are internal spaces, and there is no outside. And the problem is that when one of these spaces, photography, engages with what happens with the old digital world or with literature, you cannot translate it. The two can engage, and the encounter will be wonderful and messy and destructive at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Just shout.
Yes, I'm Lauren, and my background is in art and performance. Last week, when I introduced the way into my questions through the title, Desire, Event, full stop, version 0, and I realised I sort of talked about the Desire event bit, but not the version 0, so I think I'd mention about that. And in terms of it, this is probably the side of it that is not, I'm less sort of thought through on, but like indifference and repetition, there's the bit where he talks about a different kind of 0, a 0 divided by 0. I mean, the key quote, I'll read this. He says, there is a non-being, yet there is neither negative nor negation. There is a non-being which is by no means the being of the negative, but rather the being of the problematic. The symbol for this, and then it's brackets, non-being, or question mark -being, is 0 divided by 0. The 0 here refers only to difference and its repetition. This brackets non-being, which corresponds to the form of a problematic field. Sounds like a cut sentence. But anyway, so perhaps in Lyotard, there's that bit where he mentions the denegation of childhood. Perhaps this relates to that 0, or with this.
Can I just interrupt for a second? Now, for a second. When you say the 0 and you're equating it with childhood, and you're then attaching to this thing called denegation, why is that? Why do you have that link like that?
Well, I sort of jumped to the childhood denegation bit because he talks about in here in childhood where the child, before they learn to read, how they see the words on the page, which is almost like more like an art object, where does not speak, it's not a discourse. Oh no, that's just sort of confused. But there's different. He talks about two different kinds of. I think there's two no's or there's different kinds of negatives and negations, different kinds of zeros. So there's a more sort of radical zero that Deleuze is talking about indifference and repetition, and that zero relates. He relates it, I think, to event and difference. So it's that zero that I'm more interested in relation to this question of desire, or in relation to turning around questions of event.
Well, the Deleuzian zero is, I mean, I can understand what you're saying, but the Deleuzian zero is like Samson between two fields, between negative and imaginary numbers and positive numbers. And the zero marks the transition, as it were, except there isn't a transition, so that's why it's so radical. And in fact, a lot of civilizations don't even have zero for that very reason. It's too weird.
It's his more radical zero that is what is key.
And what does it mean to say more radical there?
Well, it's not the zero of representation where there's everything there is and everything there isn't. It's not that zero, it's a more radical zero.
It's not representation reduced to zero.
That reduces to zero, meaning?
Well, because you could say, well, the representation all the time gets more abstracted from, let's say, objects to writing, and we move over towards more and more abstract representation, and zero is the ultimate abstraction of representation. But that's a very kind of media studies approach to the zero. It's very limited because there is also something.
Not what Lauren's suggesting.
No, because I think you're saying that there is something else happening there, that the zero also has some kind of affective.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of this, I don't know whether version zero how it works in a way, but in relation to that idea of Klasowski talks about simulacra, where it's like it's the copy without an original, so that sort of relates to a kind of zero, or perhaps can be connected to these ideas of zero, this more radical zero. So that's how version zero comes in.
Okay.
And then, of course, like imperfect replication with new sciences, how that can sort of be connected to this.
So in your, when you applied for your PhD, you were saying that you were going to link this somehow with gardens, or are you not going to do that?
Yeah, no, that would be the practice element. And in terms of the garden practice, I have spotted a little plot. I mean, I was interested in the field space, but I suddenly realised that with this little plot, well, I can treat it as a field. I always used to be quite interested in like miniature gardens and miniature wells, and I wondered about using it like an outdoor studio field space where, so what I would, it's not on the sort of landscape field scale, so but if I'm working with garden, sort of the sensuous sort of energies of that, it's the sort of field aspect that I want to work with. It's not about laying out a sort of representational garden design approach to the garden.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
My name is Sandra. Hopefully I start PhD next year. My practice, I paint, and I call the last series the Unending series, which was about the kind of something that changed some metamorphosis, kind of out of becoming and my practice kind of emerged in other genres such as poetry, sculpture, architecture.
Can you say something about the materials that you use?
I kind of use different stuff, the polyurethane foam and acrylic. I kind of experiment.
They're mainly in one color or two colors.
Yes, actually I'm not kind of using the colors, kind of black and white, the grey paintings, which is about psychic confusion of black and white.
They're kind of violent. I feel like I have to pull this. Yeah.
It's about the tactile texture of seeing and messy unending process of painting.
Can we see them next week or something?
You have one on your phone now?
No,
Yeah.
They're huge.
That's
That's
huge.
another thing. They are.
Yeah.
yeah, immense.
Yes, what's the size? What would you say the size is?
353 by 2. That was the.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
My name's Lisa, PhD, and what am I doing? I'm an artist and researcher, and curator sometimes, et al. And art teacher, and I am interested in disorienting art practices and creating encounters for participants that make the participants' bodies feel out of line. And what I'm trying to do is trying to work out a way that you can activate a queer moment for the participants that is not about representations of sexual bodies or sexual communities. So it's trying to treat queer not as an object of study, but as something that happens, a kind of verb, a doing of queer. And so I'm kind of dragging Merleau-Ponty and queer theory together in a kind of quite uncomfortable way, and I'm also interested in how the philosopher's body can be made to feel out of line or twisted or uncomfortable.
What do you mean by the philosopher's body?
Just the kind of the cutting off the head and the mind, and as an artist using their body, then it's much more integrated than a kind of thinking about, I guess, text as having the way you approach text is you have a kind of corporal response to it. But it's not necessarily there in the text. So I'm very aware of, this one guy describes the practice of bringing kind of phenomenology and Foucault together in a very awkward, for fairly obvious reasons, way, that it becomes this process of becoming a cross-eyed freak. So
Who did that?
Stefan Legrand.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so it's this very dense academic text, and right in the middle of it is this twisted outline body of the philosopher. So kind of those discomforts, I suppose that's what I'm interested in, is a philosophy of discomfort as well as disorientation.
So happy bunch here. Excellent. Perfect. No, that's great. That sounds really interesting. I just wanted to mention, so I don't forget, two things. One is a thesis deadline for your articles, which will be about the problems of the classical canon. What is it called?
The cruelty.
The cruelty. That's it. Another call. The cruelty of the classical canon. 29th of October. So if you have anything.
Is there a call for papers, or there will not be one?
We're just having a very quiet call for papers because we have a very strict amount of pages. We've already got most of the journal done. It is going for review, that kind of thing. So it's just the people that are like in this room, and about 4 or 5 other people I've approached because we've already got people lined up. The other thing I'd like to say is that there was a series of interventions done by an artist. This is one of them, an unknown artist, unknown intervention. And so I got one intervened in my office. So I just wanted to see that this is a papier-mâché moment of something. Shit, meteor, I don't know, my brain, something, anyway, a brain. And we also have a new piece of work by Grace Williams. Can you just speak to that?
Yeah, it was part of my undergraduate work, where I set up a falsified archive based around kind of Victorian spiritual evaporation photographs. So it's called spiritual evaporation, but it was created using drawing with light, a technique within photography just kind of catches the image as you're moving. So I just set up the tripod and then kind of danced around and caught it with kind of a torch that I was using. But,
As you do.
Yeah. Experimental
technique called?
painting with light.
Nice. Thank you. Good. Okay, we're ready to begin. Everybody dying of heat yet? We could open that window. Could you do that without letting the photograph go on the floor?
This one?
Yeah, the one at the to the right. think it's just very, I think you just pull
Can I
the
just say
chain.
before we start
Yes.
that I brought the photocopies of the evolution of the
Oh, great,
article.
if you could pass it
So
around.
please, put yourself.
Can you just, perfect. No, I think it's good, it's good. Famous last words. If you notice, there's quite a few things around here without glass in front of them, that is because I have dropped them. They have broken. Collateral damage or them. Okay.
So the other technical bit is that apparently some of you did not receive the invitation to the mail group.
Yeah, that's fine.
So we can re-enter your addresses in the break or at the end of the session.
Oh, that's good, because my fear was that the people who didn't get it were, of course, from BIAD. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, maybe everybody felt terrible about the last session and say this is what happens when you take as a given what you try and prove. Okay, so let's begin. Let's play ball. Now we're really at the beginning of the beginning. A couple of things to consider as we, because there are, about half the group here is new, and there are Hannah who will be here mainly in January, but she'll be listening in when we get the live stream. Hopefully Jacqueline can come a little bit more, and Gian Paolo will be coming. And it is conceivable that Sheena Calvert, who's a postdoc, may be able to come the month of November. We're going to still discuss that. But before we do that, is that all right? Do you mind having postdoc people that are apart from this group here coming into the thing? Is that okay, or do you want to just private? Okay, good, great. So I'll extend it to her. Okay. The other thing I just want to say is that the idea behind this PhD seminar is to always take whatever is being said, whatever is being read, and filter it through your work. This is not going to work if you don't do that. It'll end up becoming too dry, or it'll end up becoming like all other sort of bad theory courses, which is that you're told what to read and you go read it and then you just see how good you like it or don't like it. It has to, it's like clothes. You have to try it on. You have to see if it's working, if it's speaking. So try to always remember that. The other thing is that I consider all of you, my students, even if you're not really on my committee or whatever, and most of you are, if you have any questions around method, around how your PhD should look, if you want me to read anything, any of that kind of stuff, I'm up for that. That's what I'm about. Okay, so we've got a lot of work to do, and it helps when you have more people involved doing it, as long as everyone knows that I'm running the show. That's what I thought. We have, everybody can be equal, but some are more equal than others. It's sort of like that. All right, now, okay. Last week I gave a little bit of an introduction discourse figure. Barbie, you were not able to come last week, but we voted on having this book as the starting point. So I hope that still is good. All I really want to say today is that I hope that you had a chance to read Goldbug, and that you or reread it for those of you who haven't seen it before, and also the first chapter, particularly around the way in which dialectics is being considered. Because Lyotard, while he is rejecting dialectics, he still is thinking through with dialectics. So it's a thinking with in this sense. So it's not a catastrophic getting out of dialectics per se. The wider question is, can one or does one get out of metaphysics, and does that even make sense to do so, or are we just talking one word for another word, metaphysics being philosophy and philosophy being metaphysics, and or whatever. I mean, does it mean, can you get out of air, or are you saying it like that, or can you get out of the systematic thinking, why would you want to do that, or that kind of thing, or is there something about this thing called metaphysics, 2,000 years worth of philosophy as we now know it, in all of its heterogeneous forms, that's problematic. And people like Lyotard are arguing that it's problematic. So that's the first thing you need to remember. And his position in postmodernism, in setting off those kind of series of discussions, was basically saying that the time period we're in now allows one to see that this is a problem. It allows one to bodily inhabit the problem in a way that it might not have been so obvious before. And to put it slightly differently, it's not like suddenly people are now obvious to it and they go, oh right, of course, now I see what the problem is, I'm going to do it differently. It's that literally the ground has changed so much that one just, quote, automatically, or evolutionarily speaking, does it different, or can think differently. You know, it's like the Heideggerian move, what is called thinking? What is really called thinking? What does it mean to think? And for Heidegger, it's a form of practice. That you can't have thinking on its own, as it were. Now I'm not going to, and Merleau-Ponty, for example, this is his, but of course Heidegger was his teacher, so same thing on that particular position. Now, what Lyotard does, there's a couple strands in this. First of all, like many of the left, he's obviously leftist, or maybe it's not obvious that he's leftist, but he's left. He is attacking Heidegger at all points. And yet here's the problem, Heidegger is the mentor for a lot of these people. And we're including Lacan, we're including Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, Merleau-Ponty. There was a time period where the Heideggerian move linked to Husserl was, you know, flavor of the month, as it were, or flavor of the decade, or flavor of the century, something like that. And the reason that is because Heidegger really was trying to figure out what happens when there is no ground to the truth of what you're saying. There's no ontology as such. Or to put it slightly differently, the ontology comes out of the way in which things are patterned or put together. The ground emerges from the non-ground, as it were. Now this is not all that different from Hegel and so on and so forth. That sentence is not all that different, but the way it's done is different. In the end, or in the middle of the end, Heidegger argues that it's impossible to get out of metaphysics, and I should know because I am brilliant, and I couldn't figure it out, so it's not possible, and I've tried every way. And his book on what is called metaphysics, or the fundamentals of metaphysics, is worth taking a read, because he does explain all the pitfalls that people normally fall into, and why one has to circle back and just accept metaphysics. Now, for someone like Lyotard, Merleau-Ponty, Foucault, and Deleuze-Guattari, and I would say also for Donna Haraway in particular, but also for the newer kids on the block, Karen Barad, Isabel Stengers, they're following Lyotard, or they're making a nod toward Lyotard, because his rejection of Heidegger is also a rejection of a fascistic move, which he's claiming this return to a certain form of metaphysics will always bring in a solidified, massified comment, and that the postmodern era, ERA, not mistake, postmodern time period, as it were, which also is the platform for all different time periods. So it's not like it's progression in that sense. What he's saying there is that particular move, which does not require and cannot require, and not just should not like ought not like ethically not, but cannot. It's not possible to have it. This is the key here. That in taking that as a sort of way of thinking, what he's saying is that will at least point to a way to get out of a totalitarian move that he puts into the Heideggerian approach to getting rid of metaphysics, coming back to metaphysics, so on and so forth. And so I do suggest, if you're interested in that more detailed account, you look at Lyotard's Heidegger and the Jews, with Jews spelled in little j, because the notion of the Jew in this is the ground, and also is the excess. So he's playing around with that notion. And so if you just get rid of that grounding, or you get rid of that excess, you'll have a good society, a fair society, whatever it is. And so, but what he's doing here is that in Discourse Figure, is that he's asking the question, well, if it's true, or if it's possible, for all these reasons, to require some way to get out of metaphysics. That is to say, to not have a ground in the traditional, of which is many different forms of tradition compiled in this word called metaphysics. If there's a way to do this, one thing that happens is that dialectics gets disturbed. The actual analytic way of approaching a subject. And by analytic way of approaching a subject, he's not, I hope that this becomes clear as we go on, he's not trying to privilege abstract thinking over practice. Again, he's keeping with the Heideggerian move of practice being the dwelling of thinking, as it were. And so he's saying if you take that really seriously, or anyway you take it seriously, but not quite as serious as, let's say, the rationalist, who for everything is a theory, is a way of thinking something through, is coming with an answer. If you become somewhat, it's going to disturb the way in which one is able to deal with the senses, the sexual, the uncommon, the supernatural, anything that's not normal, whatever normal is at this point, and it will basically disfigure one's systems of thoughts. So he's going to circle back to the question of representation, and he's going to, as we may know from your own work, representation, the traditional forms of representation comes from an argument, the current version, the current one that's coming out of the 80s and 1980s, 1990s, and early noughts. That comes from a certain form of structuralism and post-structuralism, a certain form of semiotic reading, which understands representation, representing, the notion of representation as the basis of identity and identity politics. And he is critiquing this move. He's trying to get rid of this position without resorting to the Heideggerian acquiescence to the fascist model, which he does think is endemic in Heidegger's work.
Sorry, can you say without resorting to what of Heidegger?
What did I say?
To Heidegger's politics.
To Heidegger's the fascism of Heidegger.
But the okay.
We can play back that tape. It isn't a problem. What did I say before?
I was just saying how he was trying to differentiate from.
I think Hegel as well, just
But they're totally different animals.
So it's about how to get out of representation without getting into fascism.
Right, because a lot of problems or a lot of good sides to the question of representation as we now know it, just like, again, I would equate it to Newtonian physics. A lot of good things about Newtonian physics can be said, but the one thing that can't happen is you can't get into space. I mean, that kind of really lame example I'm giving. There's a lot of very important things about representation as developed in semiotics and so on and so forth, but what it can't do is it can't explain the senses, it can't explain fascism, it can't, so there's problems, and so he's trying to highlight how that goes. And so rather than put on the agenda a different way of talking about representation, he's just going to call it discourse. Because the representation of the 1990s, sorry, the 1980s, anyway, structuralism, post-structuralism onward, representation comes from the form of language, or the way in which one is dealing with this thing called the language or linguistic turn that is semiotic. Sign, signifier, signified. And he's basically saying that is all very interesting, can come up with some interesting ways of understanding certain things, but it's not going to really get at these kind of issues around abnormality, normality, whatever. So he wants to maintain communication magic carpets, which he's going to call discourse, and he's going to rethink the way in which one frames those discourses as figures. So he's going to start looking at these kind of relationships between this, I'm just going to call it a magic carpet ride just for or economy as the discourse, as the way in which something gets established, pattern, whatever, and that it's in relationship to this other animal that's called the figure. Now that's the broad strokes, and we're going to find out what works and what doesn't work in those broad strokes, particularly in relation to your work. Okay, so that's so now let's open up. I would like to literally do as we need to go on. Now we already looked at the very first sentence in the "To whom is a book due?" I think that you could always ask your "To whom is the thesis due?" I mean, you're not writing a book. You do realize that with your theses. You're writing a thesis, which is not quite the same thing. Which is to say that you have to have a zillion things that explain where you got something from. Whereas with the book, you can basically ignore the footnoting. Don't do that. But it says here, let's just read this thesis. To whom is a thesis due? For the thesis itself is a modern offspring of Greek tragedy, and through it, an expiatory sacrifice. Like these, the book or the thesis is therefore already due to a debt. So he's starting off with this concept, or this position. We'll get into the relation between concept and position later, but what is this debt? Why don't we begin with a debt? Is this the same thing as original sin? Are we just no better than than the usual Christian approach to better living? That everybody has to. What is this debt he's talking about? I need you to think about this thing with the insatiable creditor, who is unnameable. Now, he does then say one cannot entertain the hope of extinguishing this debt with acknowledgments. Okay. And therefore, probably because he forgot who helped him, he doesn't put anything in there. But it does sound good, at least at the outset. So I'm asking you to remember this bit as we take this as a little annoying waving hand or something as we start looking. Think about the debt and the creditor. To whom, yeah?
Isn't it the classic starting gambit of all philosophy books to apologize for its own coming to existence?
All books.
Well, not all books do that, but philosophers particularly prone to say, well, this was a mistake. That was a very bad idea to start with. Hegel does it, Adorno does it, Kierkegaard does it. And that is because there is an obvious contradiction between setting out to critique the representation and doing it in actual representation.
So, exactly. So, in fact, that was part of your comment earlier today. Lyotard is using the book to criticize the book, and he's got his foot caught. Do you think that's the debt he's talking about?
I think the debt is definitely to do with representation. That's why he needs to do the sacrifice.
I thought it was to do with a gift. Like there's a gift involved.
You mean the Freudian sense?
No. You don't mean the Freudian sense, do you?
I just mean it. I think I mean it like the gift, as in the perhaps in relation to the given or the given. So, or the gift of the given.
So, for example, this seminar, it's a gift. We're gifting it to ourselves, okay? But obviously, it incurs a debt, and the debt is insatiable.
This is an uncompleted system. He doesn't have a final. Well, once I've written everything that I think, therefore then you will understand exactly how I think, because it's an unfinishable project. So this is the insatiable creditor, is the lack of ability to finish, and yet there he is writing a book. So I mean, it's just
which
like
has a beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah. So saying, well, he's saying, well, this is a count to infinity, and I'm going to make a start. It's an utterly pointless exercise, because he's no closer to realise infinity after he's finished the count than when he begins. So this is his debt to the insatiable creditor.
So that sounds very interesting. Grace? Wait,
Sure.
Grace, what do you think?
I'm confused.
That's right.
When you said that this seminar is a gift and then the debt, what do you see as the debt?
The fact that Well, for me anyway, when I come to this seminar, I come having thought about this a lot, having not slept sometimes, having concerns about how this is going to work, not work. Not in the sense that, you know, will I be understood, but what is the tragedy? What is the various things that will come out of the seminar that then affects all of us, or certainly affects me? Because these kind of seminars, when they work, which they will, are very dangerous, actually. And so and they're dangerous to one's own mental stability in a certain sense, but in a positive way. You know, they're dangerous in a because you start realizing what does it really mean to have this level of thirst, this level of hunger, and that it is insatiable, and that to me intellectual curiosity, or whatever you want to call it, or just curiosity, is insatiable. And when and it ought to be insatiable, to the thing. And, you know, so it's both so when you have an environment that privileges that insatiability, that's sort of the positive version, rather than thinking that there's insatiable, you're like dying and you must, you know.
Yeah.
So that's why it's a gift, because there's something that's positive about it in that sense. And I mean gift in the positive sense. I don't mean it in the Derridian sense of, you know, we're giving a gift and what are the millions of strings that are now, you know, someone gives you a gift and it's attached with like an entire, you know, array of things that you have to now repay. It's not that. It's that the insatiability starts to begin its engine, and then you're stuck, and you're kind of stuck for life. It's the good news, the bad news. You know, does that make sense?
Well, it's not what I said, but I certainly agree with it. Yeah, it's a kind of baton gift where it's sort of like a wasted thing, but it's like the gift that keeps on taking. You know?
The gift that keeps on taking.
Yeah.
That's great.
A bit like kind of syphilis or something like that.
Great.
Go on, Maria.
But you see, from the text here, the death, the sacrifice, you call the seminar, you use the expression tragedy, the give, sacrifice, and taking. Why has it got to be negative?
But a tragedy doesn't have to be
What's negative?
Well, that is negative, a tragedy is negative.
Right.
A tragedy is a situation where both options are equally without end, with the dead ends. Or more than both options, whatever they are.
Well, because I can say, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what people say, actually, before I give you my take on this. Lisa, can you think of why it would be a tragedy?
Well, why what, sorry?
Why this is a tragedy? In the negative sense, in the, you know, dark, hard, abysmal sense.
Because, can I finish what I wanted to say?
No. Yes, of course, yes, of course, sorry.
And also what Barnaby was saying about the book having a beginning and an end and a middle way. I mean, I wouldn't see the known infinity of or the known closeness of the Discourse of the book in its geometrical spatial sense. Is that on the side, each page, it doesn't have, we don't look at the first letter, the Q of the first paragraph, say this is the beginning of the book and this is where it's not completed. It's not completed on the surface.
I did say it was a count, but I didn't say it was a sequential count.
Even as a count,
Clever.
you've got even there, it's like, now the sphere is finite, and yet there is a point where it ends.
Let me put it like this, okay, to not get totally into that side of it. If you take on the mantle of curiosity, a lot of things happen that are not so good for your health. Jail,
Yeah, it's
for
very
example. I'm just saying.
Employment.
Unemployment. You know, let's say fallout with society. You know, little tiny problems like this, okay, which are a pleasure on one level, but they're kind of hard to reconcile. So that's part of the tragedy that Lyotard's talking about. I mean, the amount of people in his world that committed suicide, literally, you know, because they started really asking these questions. That's why it's dangerous, but it's also exciting, exhilarating. It's a gift. It's the gift that keeps on taking. I think I'm going to have to use that. Lisa, what were you going to say? Sorry.
I guess I just had a couple of points. I mean, in terms of tragedy, it's kind of calling forth this quite grandiose kind of this Greek tragedy, and I kind of wanted to compare his idea of the offspring to the kind of Deleuze and Lyotard, the screwing that goes on and creates other fucked up queer offspring of the books rather than this narrative that leads back to this Greek tragedy. And the other thing I thought
Wait,
was,
that's quite interesting. Can you just expand
I
on
can't
that?
say anything more than that.
But it was quite good, actually. I think the screwing thing really worked for me.
It's, yeah, I think it's a bit too neat in terms of offspring. And the other thing is, it's not the beginning of the book, is it? It's that there's a before that. It's for A-M-A-A-M.
Yeah, I've been wondering about that.
And where does that operate in terms of the, you know, inside and outside representation? Because he doesn't pin down who this figure. I presume it's a figure, maybe it's not. Maybe it's an event or a group of people, who that is. So where does that operate in this realm of? We're going to talk about representation. I'm apologising because it's in representation, but there's something else at the beginning that I don't know.
Yeah, good point. Does anybody have any comments on that?
Well, when I was looking at that, I was thinking, like, is this a rebus that I'm supposed to work out? Perhaps it's obvious to everybody else.
You set it on fire and see what happens.
It's a series.
It is a series. Okay, so we've got a lot of good things on the table here. Let's go now to the contents, table of contents. And this is just basically suggestions on how to read a book, any book, but particularly philosophy books or books that are, you know, political philosophy, theory, this kind of thing. The first thing to always do is go to the index, which of course I don't have in front of me, but the, you know, page 509 onward. Because that way you can see what either the author or the publishers, because often the publishers are the ones that do the index, thought was the important aspect. So it's just a helpful, you know, Hannah's helpful hints kind of thing. No disrespect for you, Hannah. It's just a remark. Okay, then you go to the index of names. So you kind of read it backwards, basically. That's how you begin. So once you've done this again when you look at this book, you can then see where this book may or may not be going, whether or not there's a building of an argument, or whether there's just slices of arguments that are sort of, you know, knitted together. So the first thing is the discourse figure, the bias of the figural, and then there are these kind of subplots here. So just because I'm obsessed with making sure your theses look good, he has followed a typical PhD thesis setup here, just so you know. He's got the introduction, which is the bias of the figural, which is only 20 some odd pages. Then he's got, let's say, chapter 1, chapter 2, Veduta, and chapter 3. Now the reason I point this out, and then that the publishers put an appendix, is because one of the best ways to write a thesis is with only 5 chapters. Introduction, the middle bits of 3 chapters, and the conclusion. It is absolutely works for you. How many chapters do you have?
6, but one of them's very big.
Okay. The reason I say this again is
Including introduction and conclusion.
oh, that's not too bad then. You're almost within the realm there. It just is an odd thing how when you write and you need to collect your thoughts, that it's just helpful to have a way that you know that the 3 chapters in the center spine of the thesis is basically in some way like the maypole or something, developing or setting out different aspects of the argument. And also it's helpful to know that if you think in terms of 3, 5s, and 7s, it is a very odd technique that you can develop later in life when you give lectures or when you know, I have 3 things to say, I have 5 things to say. If you have 7 things to say, people are going to die. You know, they won't hear it. And it's the same thing about your thesis. So you think, I have 3 things to say, and these are them. And then you construct a thesis around that. That's after, you know, years of research. Daniel, did you say anything?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so you can see that, if you look at it that way, you can see that this whole question of his anger, because Lyotard is, you know, usually writing in a very angry mode, and either he's writing like a real smart ass, or he's trying to write as this pious schoolboy kind of thing. It's fascinating, the kind of personalities he takes on in his different writing scenarios. But the very first chapter, as it were, is the way in which he's trying to get at why he hates those people that deal with those theories and those people who pass on those theories that deal either in the marketplace of dialectics or semiotics or both. That's what this whole thing is about. So if we look at the bottom of the chapter, so it says signification and designation, we find opposition and difference. He's going to obviously end up on that as a position. He's going to support that by saying that the no, that there's a thing called the no. And where does that put a way of grasping what's going on in relation to the object of your study? He's going to develop this thing around thickness on the margins, which is, again, how does one talk about not just the senses, which is kind of the old way of trying to talk about how things are different, but how something can have a thickness or a thinness. I mean, paint can have a thickness and a thinness. Watercolor, acrylic, whatever, but when you start moving those kind of painterly concepts onto this, onto theory, it blows the theory, and it's fantastic, and that's what he's saying here. Let's do it. Let's blow the theory. Linguistic sign, question mark, is the only one that he has with a question mark, if you've seen his work. And that he's basically saying all signs are all language is a sign, so that it's like saying language on one hand. On the other hand, to codify it into this sign, signifier, signified argument loses for him the real approach of Freud, the significance of Freud and the relationship of the unconscious, the aggressions, the hunger, the thirst, the cesspools, this kind of thing. And so he's not happy about the way in which that has been relegated and cleaned up, as it were. And again, recessus and hyperreflection again is an attack on how something can be. It was an attack on Kant, basically. And he's talking about how self-reflexivity is problematic if in the wrong hands, if handled incorrectly. And then, of course, it starts off with dialectics index form, and that's basically, he's basically saying there's a move between dialectics, the index, and the form that are often used as the same word. Dialectics often can be seen as a form, or an index, or something, and he's trying to disentangle that. And then if you read it forward, you see that dialectics is the very first way in which he begins to speak about this question of signification.
But is he trying to say that dialectics, symbols, and form is one and the same thing?
Well,
rather than trying to disentangle?
He's saying that that's how they've been used, and so he's trying to disentangle them. No, he's not saying that they should be the same thing or even are the same thing, but he's saying that often analytically is used that way, and that's the problem. Okay. I'm going to stop for the moment to see if anybody wants to get into either the bias of the figural, which is kind of John Mowatt's summation. Oh, sorry, not the bias of the Goldbug, or the way in which he developed the discussion of the bias of the figural. Anybody want to start with Daniel?
I think the bias is.
Okay. Why?
What is it? I think the Goldbug is
quite simple introduction, and it really mostly deals with this question of non-dialectical Marxism. It basically tries to articulate the politics of the book,
which is not uninteresting.
No, it is very
So
interesting.
I mean, so let's just open that up just for a second. What's the advantage of using dialectics? Basically. Well, that's one. Yeah. What does dialectics allow one to do?
Just look around and do
It allows for a form of movement. it allows to keep moving forward by absorbing whatever obstacles or contradictions or arguments and making them part of your own agenda. It's a bit like in some martial arts, you use the energy of the person attacking you to
Yeah.
defeat them.
Yeah, okay,
So
good.
that's what dialectics does.
And so therefore there's a social agent.
Yeah.
The social agent
It's culturally legible as a system.
is cultural, legible as a system and also as a way of having some kind of change enacted then, right? Because then if there's no social agent, the sort of fear is that, and it's not exactly a bad fear, is that nothing will get done. You know, if you don't have some form of organizing a political environment, then the bad guys always seem to win. And therefore, if you get rid of dialectics, you get rid of ethics, you get rid of social agency, you get rid of the political. This is why there's there's such a worry on the part of, certainly on the part of the left. Yeah, go on.
But would this mean that there are two questions in one, because the question implies another thing. Would this mean that dialectic expresses or works as a tool in a society, in a specific society? Because the word society and the word politics before dialectics, this kind of dialectic was invented.
Mhm.
Are we meaning that they couldn't deal with their own political and social or agency problems?
I mean, I hear the question you're asking as the question of, is it always in the society that one's at the time that has all the answers, as it were? You know, that takes a theory and is able to say, well, this and this is happening, whereas the Heraclitean dialectics, where Heraclitus puts his toe in the river and realizes that something that's here and there at the same time exists, and this is anyway, I'm not going to get into the Heraclitus thing. I can give, in fact, actually Mark can give tutorials on this. That's one of the things Mark is here for, to give tutorials for PhD students that need them. Right, Mark?
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyway, what I was going to say is that it's not that people thought that there needed to be a social agent before there's dialectics, or that dialectics gave people the permission to have a social agency. It's rather that historical materialism in particular, i.e. Marxism, was a very useful tool to get people to organize so that they could overthrow oppressive structures, basically.
I fully agree with this, but
Okay.
then there are two problems, or rather the same problem in two different expressions at the beginning and at the end of it.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is historically rooted, almost datable from a certain moment in time to another moment in time. Now, it is.
You mean dialectics is dateable?
But also that kind of industrial production it's referred to. We are not saying that there are no longer classes, or there is no longer exploitation, or even worse disasters. But it has changed so much that it is no longer so clear as it was then, when those that work 16 hours a day were very different than those that woke up and then branch out 12.
See, this is why this is an important discussion to have, because the dialectical method that he's criticizing is, and while it is coming from a Marxist sort of, let's say, position, he's basically saying that if you, I know that this is a simplistic way of reducing the Hegelian discussion, but if you understand dialectics as being thesis as distinct from antithesis, taken together creates a synthesis, which then comes back around and grounds the whole project. So thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and ground for the project. And then from that grounding, you then start building. For Hegel, one would say the ground that became the synthesis is the concept, is knowledge. For Marx, he's saying that it's history.
Yeah, because it moves at 90 degrees.
Yes, the reason I'm putting it like this is because you don't have to say that it's the industrialization process and locate the Marxist notion of historical materialism at industrialization, although clearly that's where it sprung from. He's basically saying you need to take history as your base. This is Marx mainly saying this. Okay, so what is being discussed here in this first chapter, in this by John Mowat. He's saying that actually, if Marx, not the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat taken together creates capitalist mode of production, which comes back around and grounds the whole thing, which clearly is one way to read this. He's basically saying if the notion of totality itself and the way in which that is able to create movement as a given has been very useful because it does signal how one can figure out what is ethical. Like if you follow the Hegelian system, the ethical is the highest substance, the highest relationship of the community to the state. I mean, this is the way the ethical community is it. So you get a way of determining right and wrong, good and bad. Those that are can carry on, those that shouldn't. And what Lyotard is accused of, in fact, most of the postmodernists are accused of, is that they have no space for ethics. That everything goes, or that nihilism will reign. This kind of thing, right? And so why do you think that ethics works? Because you're saying that for you was the primary thing that was coming out of your thesis.
Well, I think ethics works in postmodern discourse because it's not true that postmodern discourse like Lyotard's or Deleuze is kind of trying to get rid completely of any systematic logical thinking and privilege some kind of indeterminacy or chaos. I think what is going on is an attempt to create sort of tension between these two plates. So you have both indeterminacy and order playing against each other, which Deleuze calls it double articulation. But I think that's not exactly what you were asking, because it's no, I don't have to answer it at the moment. Maybe someone else.
That's good.
I understand what you're saying fully. I mean, I didn't imply that it's no longer history, but what I find, if I didn't lose what we started from with exchange, what I find difficult is that it seems to me that dialectic arose as a tool for thought, or a practice of thought, at a certain point, but from the way it was introduced now, it seemed that something, it was almost lacking before, and if it is abandoned now, it's going to still lack. Instead, I think, exactly because it refers to history, it is itself rooted in history, and history has changed.
Okay.
So the question is, can we still use it or not?
But what you call dialectics is basically logos or reason by another name.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's his critique. Do people get? Do you hear that? Samir, what are you hearing? Nothing.
So you're kind of saying, well, but what was before reason?
No, not what was before reason, because but that articulation that we call dialectics, that proposes itself, especially with Hegel, as the ultimate tool of thought, so much that philosophy had to handle with him, and even history had to handle with him, and so Marx, well, obviously history hasn't had until we're all dead and even more. So history is, somehow there is a self-contradiction in it. Mark, you're the one who knows the most about this. And there is a self-contradiction in it, because it says, well, we're unrooted in history. History changes, but dialectics still pretends to be valid. Mark?
I wanted to say this, that when you talked about Hegel and the familiar triad, of course, which you qualified, so it's not really Hegel, although he does use triadic structures, but what I just said is a dialectical statement.
What's that?
What I just said,
Oh, yeah.
and I owe this to James, about Owen, that to say that the thesis, antithesis, synthesis is Hegel, it's not really, because he rails against it. It's probably Victor, again I owe this to someone like Ingwood. But then he does use triadic structures, not necessarily the hard and fast thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But in a sense that thesis, antithesis, and analysis of the two structures to see that there's a triadic move in it. And the other thing about it, of course, you're saying it's history, but thesis itself has the sense of being in place and an orientation. So it's historical in place and orientation, and the antithesis is out of that. And then the analysis that tries to put the in and out, the in place and the outer place, as it were, the slice, the not fitting, the analysis of the two. And that's how I understand what you're saying. You're saying that it's already part of history, but I'm putting it the other way around, that the thesis itself is already in place, as it were, as an orientation, as a direction in that sense. Well, taking it out of it is taking it out, puts it into the one. I mean, there's a kind of immediacy, and then there's a kind of being, conceptual movement that then goes from being to being. We're on the road to the concept, which is where you ended up. Essence is the
Yeah.
in the antithesis there is an essence being prevailing, as it were, being prevailing. But that's
Just like
that,
that,
that's
Hegel does say this though.
what
He does use the triads in the preface.
in the phenomenology. He does rail against it in the phenomenology.
Yes, but he does also develop it so that it can be used as a shorthand to come at his work.
There's still
We'll have a longer
there's still
discussion
an
about this
argument
one.
about whether it is synthesis. I mean, in Hegel, Adorno's book on the negative dialectics, his essays on negative dialectics, he does say that synthesis is not really Hegelian word. You're really hard pressed to find the word synthesis in.
But it is in there.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying about there's the denial of the triad, the fixed thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or whether it is something other than the analysis that goes on. Not so. When you talk about, we need to talk about synthesis. I know, this is problematizing synthesis analysis, or how you understand the dialectic. And I see it sort of. It's not quite. It's a fluid understanding. But the fact that the underlying what I said. Triad in negation, despite what I said, is still a kind of example of how the dialectic thinking works. That is a kind of dialectical thinking that you negate the original and then try to analyse.
Does he not license fluidity for the first time in his structures? And in many ways,
Hegel, you're saying.
Hegel, yeah, and then in many ways sort of sets the scene for a couple of centuries later, the postmodern, which is super hyperfluid.
Can I? Yes and no.
Things were not static.
I just want to make a very, very short intervention on this, and then you jump in. The whole point of focusing on this question of dialectic is really the question again of method, and saying what gives one not so much the right but the ability to know that the way in which they're grasping at their facts or their thoughts or their ways of grasping something together is actually correct, is actually all there is to it. And the sort of useful thing, the wonderful thing about a system that relies on being a system that is either open or closed, but anyway has a totality to it, is that it allows one to be able to make comments that are not just one's own opinion, not just one's own perception, but have a wider base. This is the whole point. What good is it if we're just listening to everybody's view on everything? While that could be interesting, there's no reason to assume, unless one yells louder than the other, which one is best. And we're back to the very old problematic of Socrates and Thrasymachus, who kept saying, well, is right is might, or might is right, rather. The more you yell, the louder you get, that's the one who's right. One who, is still standing after the bombs fall, that's the one who's correct. Okay, there is some truth to that, because, history is always written by those kind of scenarios. However, on the other hand, to allow one to make an assessment of something, especially if it's going against the grain, you have to be able to do this in a way that makes sense, literally makes sense, show up and be translatable to people. And that is let's say at the moment, one of the best tools for that is dialectics. Because dialectics, basically, with all of its shortfall, and including this one, that all there is versus all there's not, taken together is the whole of the universe, is the whole problem, is the universe. All that there is and all that there's not, taken together, there's nothing that you've left out of your argument. It's the whole argument. So there's nothing that can be added, nothing can be subtracted. That's when you know you have the whole argument. Well, that's all well and good, but it doesn't operate successfully, even in, Hegel not using that in that sense either, but it's just a way of giving you a sense of how this concept of totality and universal, how come it's key. Barnaby, what were you going to say there?
No,
Okay.
Well, just Mr. Mayor, just to try to carry on from that. Basically, and also to comment on what Marx is saying. For Hegel, I mean, the price of this dialectical thinking, which is obviously very effective, is when everything becomes reduced to language.
What?
Everything becomes reduced to language. There is nothing outside language. And that is the price. That's where Lyotard comes and says, yeah, but if you have the dialectical triad or whatever you call it, if you have thesis and antithesis, you already have a gap between them. Now this gap cannot be described in language. This gap is the here and now, is the what really happens between us at this moment is something much more sensual than language. And that always escapes on page 39.
It always escapes on page 49.
Well, on page 39 he lays it in a most clear way.
Okay, hold on.
There are these like, three little snowflakes.
Okay. Yeah.
He says, in line 4, he says...
Line 4 after the snowflakes?
Well, after the, it says, it takes the here as an immediate given, when in fact it derives from a mediation. This is how the logos will be smuggled in. So the moment, he basically says, the moment you get this, the moment you start with dialectics, you already have rationality established as be-all and end-all. And then what gets forgotten is precisely the distance between, say, thesis and antithesis.
Or here and there.
Oh, here and there, yeah. And this,
39.
and so then basically the invitation is to think this distance. And that's, I think, that's the whole, what the book is trying to do, to think this distance as figure.
And
or
also,
as edge, or as thickness.
Yeah, and also not as in between.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that? Because that's the biggest problem. Is the
well, because
problem
obviously Hegel was not oblivious to
Yeah.
this distance, as he was not oblivious to anything. And
True.
and for him, it is what's called the excluded middle, which is the now, but the now as noumena, as the unknown, and because when everything is a representation, the only thing that cannot be represented is representation itself. So the distance gets subsumed into this dialectical opposition. It becomes kind of almost the driving force, the negation that energizes the whole process. But what Lyotard is trying to do is to extract this gap and say, well, the gap is where something sensual is located, something which like maybe something dialogical, maybe something that is only established in this particular moment in this room, with certain understanding is emerging because of everyone present here and not for any other reason. So that this sense of what we create right now cannot be captured dialectically at all.
So, Barnaby, could you read page? That's very well put. Can you read page 41? Because this is what I was going to draw out, but you hit it right on the head there. Just that paragraph, and to see whether or not people can hear what is going on here.
It's not the same page for 39, 41.
On this?
Starting with Hegel's theory of the sensory.
Yes.
Okay.
That's not on your page? Okay. Go on.
Hegel's theory of the sensory is aesthetics, provides unwitting proof of the existence of this gap.
Okay, so the gap being, Daniel?
Well, the gap between thesis and antithesis, so between here and now.
Okay.
Or
And in fact,
between form and content, you know, you can pick your gap. It's
Is it also the silence that he refers to on the earlier page where it talks about?
yes, all of that is part, maybe, sorry, Barnaby, maybe you should start with true on page 40.
True, to designate does not mean to point fixedly at something. The eye that did not allow itself the slightest movement would not see. The index belongs to the stone statue. But there is another kind of movement than the mind's acting in the order of signification, going through the semantic subsets where it can sample the concept it needs and articulate them in an intelligible discourse. There is a kind of movement that cannot be reduced to the activity Roland Jacobson calls selection and combination. The movement by which the sensory presents itself is always a gesticulation, a dance, a movement that, assuredly, combines with itself, since to designate and to see require the constitution of a space, an order of the coexistences. And just as assuredly, designation and seeing determine a place as their end result. Yet such a combination is not a combinatrix, and such a determination is not an implication. The result of sensory activity is a Dasein, not a Sein, seeing. The negativity that opens its...
So, does anybody know the German for this? Design?
Design is the to be there. Design is
Is like
being,
the there.
yeah, design is there. So it's what Heidegger also calls the thrownness.
Yes, okay, just wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page. Okay, go on.
So design is to be there and the sign is a throne.
No, design
no.
is being,
Oh.
to be, and design is being there, being thrown
Into the there.
The negativity that opens its distance between the eye and the object is that of form, not of category.
This is a crucial point.
I don't understand that. So.
Okay.
Well-
Anybody want to speak to that?
Say again.
Category is a logical category.
Yeah.
So in order to have categories, you already have to have a kind of a system in place, like reason. But I think when he sort of talks about form, he means about something much more immediately experienced.
Like the body,
Yeah.
See?
like the corporeality of something.
It's a distribution rather than an abstract law.
It's that well, we skipped the beginning, but he's attacking the notion of index, as you were reading, or somebody was reading, about the index, the use of it, not in the Derridian sense, but in the sense of, I don't know, the usual way of categorizing something, is basically informatics. It's just literally setting up an information trail. So he's saying that unfortunately is used as a way to make something more meaningful, when in fact really what it is a filing system, and that can't and won't do anything other than file in the most let's say limited sense of the term, to put things into categories.
As the index at the end of the book.
As the index at the end of the book, yeah. So Mark.
I was going to say, sometimes when I read this, I think they're looking for Hegel's encyclopedia, they said they've never read it, which they probably haven't. I
They
don't
probably
know.
haven't.
Which is the kind of nature, it's a kind of anthropology, but not in the modern sense of anthropology. The nature emerge, the stages of the soul is what it is. It has to do with, you know, feeling, sensibility, habit, you know, physical alteration, physical qualities, environment. I mean, you need a really modern take on this. I think you can do a modern look at the encyclopedia.
Next book.
But the thing also is also, if you look into sort of logical sense with Deleuze, and you look at the indexicals, the this, the here, the now, talking about the design of the being there. These are all indexicals which place you know, the thing in the thesis in a certain orientation. But then going through Deleuze again, you have the denotation, signification, and sense. Look at it like that. The importance of manifestation in that little arrangement of the eye, of that which speaks, and then by speaking takes it outside, this is Deleuze again, takes it outside of the signification of the chain of predicated signification, that it's in the speaking itself that the word doesn't become God, and the word is no longer God because you're engaged within it in a sense that isn't just the words. It's not
Right.
just the words.
So it's not just an authority
Yeah.
in and of itself.
So looking at it like that, looking at the dialectics through this lens of the Deleuzian indexical, it's series 3 of the propositions in the logic of extent.
Don't go there yet.
Sorry.
Just stick with this one sentence.
Anyway, so
No, that's good what you're saying, but where it says the negativity that opens its distance between the I and the object is that of form, not of category.
So
That's the translation we need.
So it is basically to say that in order for there to be any kind of vision, you first need to have an experience of distance between you and the object you're going to see. So you cannot just go and look at that. You first need to somehow acknowledge the gap. And this acknowledgement itself is not part of seeing, and it's not some kind of calculation, it's not rational. It's just this experience of, well, mortality, maybe for lack of other saying, and of your own finitude. So you need to know where you end in order to know where something you can see
Probably
begins.
there is a simpler description. Not that what you're saying is wrong, but
It's very simple.
but is it not simply that by using the word category refers to Kant, and it's saying there isn't a pre-laid out space in which the experience of sight takes place. The experience of sight is the laying out of the space.
Yes. Yes, that's all, but that's the double entendre there. Can you repeat that?
Because he uses
So
the
that's
word,
not simple, that's more complex, but anyway.
because he uses the word category,
Yes.
I thought it refers to Kant rather than, or first at least, so he's saying that the experience of seeing does not presupposes, the experience of seeing from me to you, for example, does not presuppose that there is already a space laid out, where I am here, you are there, and there is a line that allows us to see each other. But that this experience of seeing is what creates the whole relation of the fourth space.
But the thing missing in that is light, isn't it? Because if you can see light, then you can't see anything
That's
else.
his word, yes.
And you're saying that as, in what, you're right, so what is, why does that matter to what Mattia was saying? Can you just elaborate that slightly? You're right to position that.
I guess the absence here is the light, and as Derrida argues that that is the condition of metaphysics, is light. That's the very heart of it.
It would also be Heidegger, if one wants, about the clearing and the opening up of an horizon that is the event of the world. But there is always a risk with all these readings to me that one thing comes first, light or the space for Kant or something else. While it is the relationship between all these things where, without presumption, I am as important as the light that permits me to see all of you, and you are as well. There is an equilibrium between all the participants rather than, which does not mean it's positive and happy. It can be very painful. It can be beautiful or painful, but there isn't an hierarchy where one thing comes first or is more important. than the
Surely
next.
isn't, sorry, I'm sure you know more about this, but there is a hierarchy there, and the light is at the top by its absence. It's almost like it's not even seen, so that's the mediation of everything.
So
Without
Barnaby,
our eyes, the light wouldn't have any meaning.
But I would think Barnaby, your work with Bataille and his obsession with dark, anus, this kind of thing. Can you respond to Lisa's concern about seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, I think it's very true to understand light in a hierarchical sense, light and seeing. And I think that this sentence, perhaps, I don't think it deliberately does it, but there's something of the notion of form, which Lyotard perhaps is looking to cut through that form exists as a form that I think he's trying to kind of physicalize physicalise a sort of dialectic, if you like, and physicalise the distance, and
Like physicalize the word embodiment.
yeah, embody, if you like, and the form is equally applicable whether you can see it in the light, or see it using your eyes, or whether you can feel or hear it. But the categories would perhaps the difference between categories would perhaps be lost in. Perhaps I'm speaking in slightly too metaphorical sense, but I don't think it's, you know, I don't think it's irrelevant. But I think that's what's coming across here. That there's a space between bodies, which is there and is is a kind of almost like a sort of revolutionary challenge to sight. And I think this is where Merleau-Ponty, who you mentioned earlier on, you mentioned the kind of notion of eyes crossed. And I think this is where he started to, his thoughts started to become increasingly irrelevant in the later part of his career, because he really he never saw beyond the visible. You know, the visible and the invisible, yes, but he didn't start to really approach a kind of true source of form, and he couldn't hear it and he couldn't touch it, or he didn't hear it and he didn't touch it. And I think that this is where the kind of, if you like, the sort of gender politics of the 60s and 70s outgrew Merleau-Ponty. So I suspect that
You're going to have to come back and attack him on this.
yeah, well, or just have a. I think that you might struggle with Merleau-Ponty for these reasons, you know. And if you go back to him, you might have to just change it completely, depending on who you're reading him through.
Well, I think people are reading him through different ways, aren't they?
Mm.
They're not just giving up on him like, say, Judith Butler did, because his examples are pretty crap and universally male. But there are other people that are using it, particularly in trans studies, for example, where embodiment is key to it, that they are doing it. Or Catherine Basselow, who is, you know, book Textures of Light, is very much about that tactility of light and how you grasp things in that way. So I'm not apologising for it.
Yeah,
I
it's
think
it's revisiting.
relevant.
It's like Daniel said. It's if rather than perhaps everything being entropic.
Yeah.
You mean
Entropic.
Objectual
Entropic.
entropy.
Yeah, that there is order and there is hierarchies within an entropic state, and the kind of insistence on visibility. There is a sense. I mean, trans studies is interesting. There's there's an insistence on a given order, you know, which is gendered codes of dressing, and whereas there's a kind of fluidity of states, nevertheless there's a kind of recognition of given ideas of dressing without which it's not possible to transgress. I mean, this is Foucault talking about Bataille again in the preface to Transgression, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. There's, in a way, it's kind of interesting to perhaps go back to Merleau-Ponty and say, well, the visibility is just one thing. We've explored other senses. We understand that you didn't recognise it was hierarchical at the time, but we'll forgive you for that and go back to it. I mean, Christ, if you ignored the male bias of almost everything that we're reading, you know, where they had incredible liberation strategies, but they didn't notice the woman sitting next to them, or you know.
But why did you say that you felt that Merleau-Ponty was now time to let go of Merleau-Ponty?
No, I think that's already
gender politics.
No, I think that happened.
I see.
I
You're
think
saying
that happened
that's-
in the 60s.
yeah.
I think possibly it's time to revisit him. I don't know. That's what Lisa seems to be interesting to me. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No,
I think that's why he. I think that he's the phenomenological imperative isn't something that's been truly kind of lost, but he's lost ownership. He lost ownership of it because of the sort of hierarchical nature of his writing.
But
You
for
know,
some
the
of
concentration on sight and
For some, if
visibility.
you think about his term irreducible ambiguity, I mean, I think that's quite an interesting term to tease out what we mean here. I mean, brings up, you know, this idea of flesh, the working up of this between the two, the entre deux. I think there's still stuff in there that's worth digging out. You know, I'm certainly not an apologiser for the phenomenology, but I don't totally dismiss him. And I'm not.
I think that also,
I'm still reading Heidegger, and he's a Nazi, you know. So it's,
right.
I
And also,
forgive
there's
Merleau-Ponty for just being
a ton
kind
of
of.
it, everybody we're looking at really is dealing with phenomenology one way or the other, so it's a real approach back. No, what I was trying to actually badly steer the thinking toward was to think what was this notion of the ambiguous with respect to what Lyotard's doing, because that's what he said. This relationship here, the negativity that opens to distance between the eye and the object, is not a category. No, it's this ambiguous, sensuous something, and he's not going to use the same terminology as Merleau-Ponty, but that doesn't mean it's not the same thing as Merleau-Ponty in this particular example. So that's why I thought that was interesting. That was your question, the sentence, because what was being said here was precisely the way in which, or it was another way of coming at the fact that you can't use these kind of, let's say, the typically logos, phallocentric logos arguments, because they then take as a given what they're trying to prove, or they hide in a way that's not useful, this concealing and revealing, this whole question of the ambiguous.
So Merleau-Ponty's kind of saying, isn't it, that you can't reduce experience to thought,
Yes,
and that's where the flesh, that
yes, that's exactly right, and that's what Lyotard is saying. They're both saying this. I mean, he's just saying it in a more, let's say, he's trying to talk about how this thing called the gap is almost like, I'm talking about Higgs boson, because the gap in physics right now, this negative gap is, in fact, this zero, what are they calling it now, zero positive move of the God particle, which actually somehow attracts something in order to get started to create this cohesion, but it's in the gap. It only exists in the gap.
I think the gap also comes into this text from Heidegger, because he talks about the interval.
Yeah.
And he talks about the interval as what makes the human. So for him, machines don't have an interval; they have input and output. But the moment you have an interval, which is another, you have human agency. So
yeah. What's the difference? I'm sorry. What's the difference between Heidegger's notion of dwelling and his interval? Does anybody want to give it a run?
The interval.
Versus dwelling.
The Dirac interval.
Yeah.
Holding out and then leap into the framework. And in the belonging together of being, and the being and belonging, the leap out of the belonging together into language, into the frame, is the difference. It doesn't really articulate, it just calls it a leap into language. That's what it says, which is the same problem you've got here. You talk about here, the movement from the immediate sensory into language. So is this the difference?
Yeah. I mean, another way to put this that might be for those of you that are hearing this for the first time, so it must seem like, don't get overly concerned about that yet. But the problem is, on the one hand, if there's no movement, then nothing changes. Then everything is as it ought to be, this kind of thing. So obviously, if you don't believe that, or for whatever reasons are questioning it, and you believe that things should change, then the question becomes, how can you bring change into an analytic, systematizing way of thinking without change being being so changing that nothing has a prediction to it? So for example, I can say the sun goes up, the sun goes down, there's change within this movement, within the movement of the circulation of the sun. But if the sun started going all around the houses, and the sun started, being batted out of the universe and then came back in when it felt like it, that would be a totally different form of change. So the question has always been, how does one deal with change and at the same time keep it within the family, as it were, keep it so that one can make predictions and one can one can have ethics, because again, you know, if everything is changeable, then it's kind of like, again, who wins at the end of the day is the one who is the last one standing. And then change is that form of change would be problematic. So in order to deal with this question of change, there has to be some relationship to what makes it work or what makes it stick. These basic terms that we keep that we will keep going over and over again.
So
Yeah.
you talked earlier about the Higgs boson, isn't it? Interesting when we talk about the underdetermination of theory by experience in physics.
The underdetermination of theory. That's nice. I like that. Yes.
And then when you're talking about the predictive nature, which I think is science, it does come together in its predictive understanding of being able to actually do things. Say in quantum mechanics, they do get interesting results. But when you then think about, well, that's in science predict, but then when in sort of things like economics and things like this, where it becomes no longer quite clear how the predictive analysis would work, I think there's a problem there. Where you change. We're talking about physics.
Well, I don't think that it's all that cut and dry in physics either, by the way.
Oh, no. That's what I'm saying with the underdeveloped.
But the basic position, I'm not even thinking about economics here, I'm thinking about politics. In political theory, the basic canon in political theory is to be able to determine what comes next, at least within a week. You know, how far is the next step happening? So the very basic position, you know, that there's always leaders and led, and that in that context, you know, how one, I mean, I'm not saying that should be the case, I'm just saying that that's the basic deep cut. There's always leading and always led, and then one goes forward. The question becomes one of whether or not you can, when I say prediction, I mean several things by it, like useful. Or, for example, you're sitting here with, you know, furrowed brows, you know, trying to, like, you know, exhausted brain, trying to come up. What happens if, at the end of the day, this is just bullshit? It has nothing to do with anything. Now, it's very possible that is in fact the case, you know, but it's probable that it isn't so much the case that you would waste your time to come here to do that. That's what I'm saying about prediction. It's a probability factor that goes in, and this notion of probability as prediction is key to, well, the 21st century for one thing, or even the 20th century. The way in which change can be dealt with in a way that, so you're just not, you know, I have nothing else to do, so I think I'll just drop in here and see how it goes. Like that kind of scenario. That there's something that's being worked on. Or is it just, you know, like kind of like the, you know, the famous elephant where everybody's sort of figuring out, well, it sounds like this, and yeah, Barnaby.
I mean, I've been reading this In Search of the Multiverse, and so what I'm about to say comes pretty much from there.
Okay, can you say who wrote this book?
John Ruby.
Yeah.
John Ruby, thank you.
Who's great, by the way.
Yeah,
it's a great book.
It's a fantastic book, and I mean, first of all, the thing which I'd like to take issue with, when things were static, it's not. I think it's not necessarily true to say that's so. If things are static and not movable, or not moving and not movable, that's how they should be, because I think that's probably quite wrong. That's how they shouldn't be. I mean, I'm thinking about now.
Yes,
I'm
that's very true.
talking about physics. I'm talking through physics. I'm thinking about the pre-Enlightenment and pre-Hegelian, pre-dialectical manoeuvres, or rather, lack of manoeuvre.
No, when I say, I feel like I'm reading when I say it says, no, the static thing is the political nature, that people in a social environment don't realize that they can change, but it's not a question of simply waking up one day and going, oh, you know, I can change. Sometimes it is, but it's to say that the social itself can be established in such a way as to foreclose any possibility of change. And so in rethinking how this deals with our world, our human world, or whatever, sentient being world, that's the question of the stay seat that's being overthrown.
Okay, I mean, just to continue, I mean,
Okay.
the book sorry, I don't wish to.
That's fair enough.
It's just that if we experience time in a kind of linear way, which is popular, that linear notion of time, that linear experience of time does exist, but only in the sense that things will become simpler. So when things start to move, they go from more complicated to simple, and I don't really see that that's not a good, or at least a workable interpretation of politics.
It goes from more complicated to simple.
Things tend towards
Simple.
entropy.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, it is, John.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when you say when things happen, they kind of sort of find this way of workability, which I know is like one of your favourite sort of things.
Not workability, cohesion.
Okay, well, you like to say if things work. I mean,
Okay,
cohesion
yeah.
means sort of understanding how things work.
Yeah,
You know.
whatever.
And effectively, that's things becoming simpler.
That's not.
No.
Why not?
I will actually argue the opposite. That cohesion is when things become articulated, therefore complex, and there isn't something else. There are only forms of complexity. And to go back to the predictability for the political element of it, I think that half the key, I can't yet articulate the other half, is that hegemony of the discourse has to do with the past. Or I can't say vice versa, the past is hegemonic, but there is an element where hegemony and the past act in one way, and the present is an open frontier, there is no future, it's made. So the political happens there, or better, that's the position of the political community.
Interesting.
I think it can be put maybe, it can be made a little bit simpler in saying that dialectics is incredibly useful if you want to get out of sovereignty. Because if sovereignty is a kind of system, whether religious or political, when there is a sort of head of state, dialectics gives you the tools how to overcome that. However, in so doing, dialectic creates another form of sovereignty, which is based on its way of operation, which is to do with reason and logic. So that's why people like Lyotard come and say, well, okay, it did its job. It's kind of like Foucault's disciplinary society. It did its job, and now we need to find a way to get out of this structure of reason. And that's where the notion of the gap comes in, and that's why the notion of the gap is also a question of politics. So it is, dialectics allows you to move, but it always allows you to move in relation to a immovable center, which is yourself, or the anthropos, or the logos.
Subject. It's
Yeah.
the subject that's
It's the
required.
subject, it's logic, it's reason, you know, everything else can move, but not the center.
This is exactly what I was saying with the past as in hegemony. I mean, because he's speaking from that starting position, or that immovable position, he can only move in relation to that. Therefore, the steps are always rather small, and therefore fairly predictable.
Okay.
There is
While if you abandon this idea that you're speaking in relation to or trying to get away from something, then immediately you have a plurality of options. I didn't read this book in depth, but when I just browsed it, I found
What book is this you're reading?
the Discourse figure.
Oh, I see, right.
When browsing it, what comes before immediately is that he speaks constantly about language and the visual, or language and on the body, the discourse. There is this, you say no?
No.
So there is this dual element, almost atypical. Language is the father, I want to try to get away from it. Forget it, do something else. Why should you contrast its authority? If you could forget it within quotation, then plenty of other options. And then you wouldn't be rooted in that authority or hegemony of the subject, which keeps the dialectical move working as a perfect mechanism, but always step by step by step by step.
But that is what Daniel's saying. Or are you criticizing?
No, I'm saying that Daniel was describing Lyotard's position, if I understood it.
Lyotard says that it's a question of ontology. It's a question whether ontology is a matter of sense or a matter of symbols or logic.
Mm-hmm.
And he says if your ontology is based in logic, you will never be truly able to move, because you always have this center. So he suggests to place sense at the basis of the ontology.
So in other words, the margins.
Or the gap, yeah.
And so that's, so the important, or one of the important things out of that, just to make sure that people hear it, is that the gap itself is the, or not just itself, but the gap expresses one, let's say, approach that is political. It's not the only form of the political, whereas in dialectics the political gets put in various spots. So one could say that the ambiguous becomes the political position. And so one is not out, so this is a...
But wouldn't the political position actually to be to open up this problem? Because it seems to me that what we end up doing, or what this discourse ends up doing, is to speak about philosophy. And obviously, you will never get anywhere else, so you keep all the rulers in the same place. And those who have power keep it, and those who don't have it. Opening it up, thinking that sense can take place through different ways of making sense, all the artistic bits. And then engaging with philosophy, but not thinking only that philosophy speaks about philosophy. Because otherwise we give all the hegemony to the past, and we can only speak about what has been already said. And yes, it is very important to carry our history with us, but if we don't open it up to all other experiences, then we are stuck, literally stuck.
Okay.
And opening up is the gap.
It's more than a gap, because a gap is always in between things.
No.
This
that's
is
the
opening
point.
up without the other side. You open up. It's open.
Okay, let's hold off on the discussion of the gap, because that is crucial, because the gap is not the in-between, that's really, but you know that.
Yes, but it's important to say that gap is not in between.
It's not the in-between,
Yeah.
yes, of course, okay, right. Barnaby, want to continue with the next sentence? Page 41.
Hegel's
Here,
theory.
I'll tell you what, here, take that, I'm going to leave you. Okay.
Hegel's theory of the sensory, his aesthetics, provides unwitting proof of the existence of this gap. The critical assessment of the sensory's communication with the sensible, sensé, does in fact confirm the absorption of seeing by saying, which is the Hegelian fantasy.
Say it again, this sentence, or these two sentences.
Hegel's theory of the sensory, his aesthetics, provides unwitting proof of the existence of this gap. The critical assessment of the sensory's communication with the sensible, sensé, does in fact confirm the absorption of seeing by saying, which is the Hegelian fantasy.
What does this mean? What's he railing on about? Here he starts getting into his I'm mad at everyone phase.
Well, I think it's what we said earlier, that for Hegel everything is language.
Okay, but one of the key things here, I mean, just to, it's a bit obvious when you say it, it's not saying it. No, is that art is where senses lie, and philosophy is where theory lies, and philosophy trumps art. That's Hegel's
Yeah,
position.
seeing by saying.
Yeah, seeing by saying.
Yeah, that the old theory can describe and say this is a meta language for everything else.
And so he's basically saying that position is a fantasy.
And art is kind of underdeveloped philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's much worse than a fantasy. It's dictatorship.
It's a dictatorship.
Yes.
Wow, that's strong.
Well, is this not what we experience in art education?
I don't explain that.
Well, my impression, I started art education when I was already practicing art. So I arrived in as fairly confident of what I was doing, and that what I was doing was leading the research. I arrived in school in Britain to do a master, and I basically was told, well, read here, this is what you're doing, this is going to be what explains what you're doing, what illustrates what you're doing, and this is what you have to illustrate. And if you instead rejected that and tried to work with the qualities and the dimensions of whatever attracts you, it was not recognized.
Until
Until
clinic.
But now you're not making art.
No, but I think as another
Minor
practice.
He is thinking about it.
Yes, thank you.
I'm actually doing things, but I don't have enough time for it. It's different. But this is another practice.
No, but that brings us back to the sort of the introduction, where he's sort of trying to. Oh, he refers to the bit where not the only way to change the world is that bit, but so it's like it seems to me that sort of while he's arguing that art does not speak, there seems to be sort of in terms of the way the unconscious or the primary processes work here, there's the radicalness there that does not speak, which is a way, like a practice of thinking, and that's what's critical. That this difference is there just as much as in the art that does not speak. So the reference to like, is there only one politically progressive way for philosophers to stop interpreting the world and change it? Is no, there's not only one. Well, I presume that implies that the only way is to sort of do perhaps sort of like practical things in a sense of like go and buy some food and give it to somebody, like a practical just like that, as opposed to sort of thinking the practical, more radical practical difference that is an event, which there's an importance about that.
Okay, we're going to make you stop on that one. Let's go back to these two sentences again. And let me just say, does everybody know who Hippolyte is?
John Hippolyte.
Yes.
He wrote a really good book on Hegel.
Yes.
Introduction to it.
And
he
that,
was teacher of Lyotard. And
yes, he
other-
was teacher of the entire
yeah.
French, most of the French philosophers that one comes across studied Hegel via Jean Hippolyte. Okay, and so often the reading of Hegel is not through Hegel, but through this book, which is why his name is the next name in the list.
Jean Hippolyte picks up on the two uses of meaning, sens, Hegel distinguishes. Meaning is certainly a curious word, which is, in turn, used in two opposite ways. On the one hand, it indeed identifies the organs that govern immediate apprehension. On the other, we call meaning a thing's signification, its idea, its universality. Thus, meaning refers on the one hand to the immediate exteriority of existence, and on the other, to its interior essence. Reflective consideration, instead of separating the two parts, ensures that the one presents itself at the same time as its opposite. When it perceives something through sensory intuition, it simultaneously apprehends this thing's meaning and concept. But since these determinations are received in a non-disassociated state, the beholder is not yet conscious of the concept that she or he only vaguely feels. Which Hippolyte goes on to explain in these terms. There are, therefore, intermediaries between the sensory and the signification that is only present in language, and the transition from one to the other appears in the dialectics of the arts as well as in that of the mind. One should not, however, be misled by the term intermediary, since Hegel's philosophy is a philosophy of mediation. Signification, as it comes to the fore in language, and meaning as the concepts becoming in discourse, these are before the movement that seem to generate them. There is no meaning before language, no more than there is an ineffable absolute, and no more than there is a dream state for the person who never wakes up.
You want to
Carry on?
Yeah,
This-
carry on.
this
We're going
straightforward-
to come back to this. This is like the crux of this argument here.
This straightforward explanation succinctly identifies the Hegelian problematic at issue here. For on one hand, it locates the Hegelian difficulty on the opposition between exteriority and interiority. In other words, on exactly what we referred to as the two definitions of meaning. Meaning in interiority, which is signification, sin, and meaning in exteriority, namely designation, Bedeutung. The importance of this opposition will become clear. But for now, suffice it to note that in some respects, the entire Hegelian problematic is indeed to resolve the meaning from exteriority, that which is given as coming from elsewhere, Bedeutung, in a signification that is entirely immanent in a system, The aim is to build an enclosure that can hold openness within it.
Okay, now just skip the, this next, well, actually.
Can I just say that in
Yeah.
some translations, this very quotation,
Yes.
where in English it says meaning is certainly a curious word, and in some translations it says sense is a curious word.
Quite
So I think it helps to read it again with sense instead of meaning, because I think sense is closer to in English, sense holds these two dimensions of the inside and outside, as sense as emotion, but also sense as something can have sense, better than meaning.
Yeah,
Meaning
Yeah,
sounds
because
very-
in French the word is always sense for meaning and for sense.
meaning
Indeed,
sounds
the French
already
text is
very
always
rational
sense.
in English.
Yeah,
You know?
no, yeah, meaning definitely sounds like it's much more logocentric. But I think he's doing that on or the translators are doing that on purpose because they're trying to show just how, quote, one-dimensional that move is.
Mm.
Because when you get further down the page, when they start getting into this whole argument, or he gets into this argument about how that what's having to happen is to get rid of this question of meaning in this logocentric form. And he starts getting, well, actually, maybe, you want to read that paragraph, just to have another voice.
On the other hand, Hippolyte rightly notes that art is not yet this integration of meaning with itself, and therefore can only be for a system thus haunted by the obsession of signification.
Can you just read it again?
Yep. On the other hand, Hippolyte rightly notes that art is not yet this integration of meaning with itself, and therefore can only be for a system thus haunted by the obsession of signification, an intermediary. But, as Hippolyte also observes, in a philosophy of mediation there can be no intermediary, for everything is intermediary. Only a dualist thinking can accommodate the intermediary. The merging of body and soul and the schema. In a philosophy of logos-driven mediation, there is no given before mediation, and thus no meaning before signification. There is no meaning before language. One can understand why Hegel does not manage to grant art as a status of sufficiency, if the aestheton is for him merely a logikon, oblivious of itself, that has not yet acceded to the in itself for us. Yet it is not for lack of trying to draw a clean line between symbol and sign, to show that and how in the former the sensible is immanent in the sensory.
Okay, stop. What do you think you read there? Prof, that was very good reading. The first time the seminar, excellent.
I think I draw a blank when I read out loud.
Okay.
So
It's pretty good. Take it.
That's right.
sorry. So he says haunted by an obsession of signification as an intermediary. When he says intermediary, does he mean is he relating to the gap again? That's the intermediate.
Yes. And that's the intermediate as an in-between, as opposed to as a gap that's been expressed differently.
So, because you said earlier that it shouldn't be read as a gap, as a in-between. So why is it different?
In Hegel, it can be read in the way Hegel is being, let's say, framed here, which I use very pointedly. The way he's being, sort of explained, is that if you have, with the dialectic, if you have the thesis, antithesis, so on every side of the thesis there's the other side is the antithesis and vice versa. So, well, for many people, this then creates what's called the excluded middle. So that this side can never be on that side and that side can never be on this side and so on and so forth. So this thing is what's considered as the in-between.
Yeah.
And analytically, Lyotard is criticizing that. He's not the only one. I mean, Wittgenstein is one of the main criticizers of this argument. But anyway, because what he's saying is that when you pose it this way, which is the dialectical approach, and then you take it together, whatever, we'll get into the whole thing in a minute. When you pose it this way, what happens is that art becomes relegated to insufficient exploration, explanation, whatever, expression of practice, of thinking. And so he's basically criticizing, he's saying that you do need to deal with this thing gap, but the gap is a sense, is the senses. And art is precisely that, not insufficient about that. So that's what that is more or less kind of sort of saying.
Because according to the historical approach, people first learned how to paint, then they learned how to read and write and how to think. So art considered as a kind of the primitive form of thought in this Hegelian historical perspective.
But that's not only the reason, this sort of anthropological, totem that happened. I mean, it's also because there is something to be said about a logocentric argument. That it actually can provide some form of an answer, and that art doesn't set itself up to provide an answer, and therefore it shouldn't be being accused of not providing an answer since it's not supposed to be setting up answers anyway. Is that kind of argument goes in there?
Would it also make sense to say that the gap, rather than being, if we think of gap in trivial terms as something that is in between things, we already know it's not that, but as a way of approaching how it is not that. The gap is not between these and that. The gap is the fact that these circle, rather than being a closed perimeter, has a gap.
And what's the gap that it has?
Well, it's not concluded.
It's not what?
It's not concluded. It's not a continuous line. That
But it
defines
is a continuous
line.
line.
But it's open,
It's closed.
and yet it has a gap,
How does it have a gap?
because it's not closed.
There's only a gap where you drink from. That's good.
No, the reason I'm challenging you with
Mhm.
this is because you're not making the argument, you're making a statement.
Yes, no,
It's
I
closed, I say it's open, you say it's closed, I say it's open.
But if it is closed, then I've got a closed identity, a fixed identity, everything else that is out. Then I need the gap in between if these and these are closed.
Why?
Because this is a concluded body, object, thought, or concept, and this is another one. And then absolutely I need this external thing that takes them together dialectically.
Okay, you're shaking your head.
No, because there is the experience of the distance between them. I think what you're trying to do is exactly to think the distance in a kind of in logical terms. But you don't need the lid to be open, because there is the sense of finitude that comes with it,
By what you mean?
by which it has an end.
What has an end?
Well, the lid in that case. I mean, it's like what Heidegger says about the nothing. But what can we say about this nothing? So you can say there is the cup and nothing else. But what is this nothing? So that and that can be only comprehended or kind of approached intuitively.
I think I understand Matthias' critique,
Okay.
which is that if we're discussing form rather than category, that if the forms themselves are completed rather than partial, then they're objects in themselves. If they're categories, then there's a certain openness and unfinishedness. But if Lyotard wants to insist that they're forms, that therefore they are closed forms, even if they're closed conceptual forms. And I think what Matthias is saying is that if they're closed between us and object, then therefore there must be the gap exists between them, rather than in a kind of in a partial
Is that what you're
object
saying?
sense.
If they're closed, the gap exists between. But let's move away from a visual metaphor like this. Let's go back to the fact that the book has a beginning and an end, therefore it seems limited. The fact that the book has a gap, it's not because it's missing pages, or not because it is just a segment. It's because we're still talking about it.
Okay.
It's not concluded, or because it's simply not meant to be concluded. Like we are still talking about an image. The image does not have one meaning. We can keep revisiting it and engaging, not explaining it, but engaging more.
But then what does that do to the very concept of finitude if everything in fact is always not finished, even if it is?
Well, it's more positive than finish it and say, well, this is it.
Okay, yeah, no,
stay
that's
that
a
box.
slightly better than-
You reduce finitude to an immaculate conception, effectively, with that critique.
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly wrong. Lisa.
Sorry, I didn't understand. Why is it exactly wrong? Because infinitude seems to be an immaculate conception, and it's negative.
Nothing is finished apart from the virgin, the pregnant virgin.
Sorry? that was
Well, that's the immaculate
We're going back to
conception.
the vaginal
No,
wall.
that's the immaculate conception. It's that nothing is closed, nothing is finished, unless it can be completely understood. But he said we discussed in the book. But why even read it? You know, it should be. You know, then it's flawed or not finished because it actually needs to be read. You know, it exists as a kind of immaculate state of ideas, which, you know, even by the fact that you need to open it, it's already starting to kind of be flawed or unfinished. So it effectively means that that kind of radical position reduces the notion of finitude or closedness to an immaculate conception, or the pregnant virgin,
But that's
of which we are all
I'm quite,
familiar.
Annoyed now about that.
I'm quite fine with that in a way that I don't want to defend finitude.
Right, yes,
Okay.
yes, that's exactly
So
right.
it's fine. Finitude becomes this paradox of the immaculate conception, and as such doesn't exist.
Okay, hold that thought there. Lisa?
Okay, I'm not understanding your difference between the open category and the closed form. And I'm wondering if we relate that to Matthias' two objects, but we choose the cup as the category man and the glass is placed as the category woman. And where's the form, where's the category, and where's the gap?
It's in the denotation. The denotation here can fulfill the gap true before you then move through signification and the rest of it.
What do you mean by
Well,
denotation?
Well, when you point to this, you say this cup and there, you do know what you're talking about initially. Yeah, that's like before the thing then moves. It's like static dialectical image, movements, static emotion. So I think, and again, I'm really thinking this as again, it's still that we can agree in the denotation stage with what it is we are pointing to, gesturing to, something like that.
Does that making more sense or
Not
no?
really. I'm just wondering whether we can agree to that as well.
But you see,
Well, if we can't, then we are then leaping, I think, into what you with the sense language fantasy, where the fantasy if you don't step outside Hegel actually means something like name, so it would be like sense language name, which is the fantastic, because the name is arbitrary. Obviously, everyone has different names for different things. But even though we have different names for different things, we still have a denotation in certain cases which can be fulfilled or not fulfilled about what we're gesturing to.
Is the act of denotation sensorial?
It's back to there's the indexical, the designation of the design, because the design exists in the there.
You're pointing to it. So is it
the
a visual
gesture?
category?
Well, the gesture comes up in here
Yeah.
as prior to the language. He asks, I think, about gesture relation. Is gesturing a part of language? And then.
and if you want to read more on the question of the gesture, Sheena Calvert has a whole chapter on the gesture in her thesis, which is there, and everybody can take a look.
But also that.
Oh, right.
This is very good, precisely because it talks about Roman Jackson.
He meaning
Lyotard.
Oh, Lyotard,
we
yeah.
just read it earlier when he mentions Roman Jackson, which Jackson is kind of associated with Saussure and with whole semiotic approach to language. No, I think the kind of the classic linguistics, the bad linguistics, where floating signifiers and denotation and, as you say, arbitrary signs can mean arbitrary things, and that can all change. And what Lyotard trying to do, and I think following these guys here, is to say, well, there is something else. There is the way meaning is established is not according to some dictionary definitions, let's say male, female, but according to the specific acting in a concrete situation. So that's the horizon of existence, the present moment that establishes the meaning of the utterance. So in that sense, he goes against the traditional linguistic approach. But he's not going out of linguistics. He stays with linguistics, but he wants to say that language has more to it than just signification.
Than just language as such. Yes, and the question of the gesture is crucial to this whole move that he's making. I'm glad you pointed it out. I mean, what is a gesture?
Well, remember last week?
Of course,
remember last
yeah.
week I spoke about the Vorstellung?
Wait, no, you have to do that.
Sorry, I spoke last week about the representation of the German Vorstellung.
Yeah.
But this is, they can see within this an idea of place. And I was saying that the Vorstellung has a sense of firmness, or, and the other word for place, language, has a sense of comfort place. One's kind of firm, one's. And I was thinking about this in terms of what you were saying about the Lyotard, right at the end of the figure, or between the bias, between the discourse and the figure. The solidity of the language, as it were, and the fluidity of the vision, maybe. Or maybe another discourse going, sort of a Freudian discourse between the eye and the mouth and the anus. And whether they're actually two different energy levels. And I can't articulate that. But this movement between the solid and the fluid, as it were, between the presentation of language and then the understanding of sense, there seems to be this kind of
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, has anybody read Cora by Derrida? Cora, C-H-O-R-A.
Like you find in Christova.
Like
Yeah,
you
yeah,
find in
Christ-
Christova,
yeah. I read it.
Yeah, I mean, because in Cora, Derrida is basically making that claim. That's pretty much what the book is trying to establish. You know, this relationship between, you know, there's a real thing, the phallocentric X, and Cora represents, or can be sort of employed to be a substantial and substantive different way to deal with it. Now, of course, the Cora then is the female, and the phallocentric is the male. So once again, we're going back to that trope. But he is literally doing. He's literally doing.
But it makes me think that it somehow is an argument that believes or tries to get out and just relaunches the problem one step further. Because Cora in ancient Greek, like in modern Greek, means girl. So he's still referring to an origin of language. So he's not moving out.
That's interesting. Yeah. Can you say something? No. Okay, let's just try and get through that next page. So, having read that,
Should we open it up on the top?
of course.
That's a rhetorical question.
That's right. But that's how the gap functions, as rhetorical. As a rhetor. Can you read again that, where did you start before? Yeah, can you read that paragraph again now, see if it makes any more sense? So now when you read, or Barnaby, could you read it? And so that you can listen to it. Okay.
On the other hand, Hippolyte rightly notes that art is not yet this integration of meaning with itself,
Or sense.
and therefore can only be for a system thus haunted by the obsession of signification and intermediary. But as Hippolyte also observes, in a philosophy of mediation, there can be no intermediary, for everything is intermediary. Only a dualist thinking can accommodate the intermediary, the metaxy, the merging of body and soul, and the schema.
Okay, what does that mean? You have furrowed brow there, Barnaby. What does that mean?
I can't think and read at the same
Oh, I
time.
see.
I have exactly the same problem.
Okay.
So I was praising so highly. It's just selfish interest. Do you want to ask somebody else, or shall I continue?
Go read that sentence again, then, please.
But as Hippolyte also observes, in a philosophy of mediation, there can be no intermediary, for everything is intermediary. Only a dualist thinking can accommodate the intermediary, the metaxy, the merging of body and soul, and the schema.
What does that mean?
I don't know what metaxy means.
It just means come together.
Yeah. The mix. Yeah. Combination. Yeah.
What is dualist? Is that a way of thinking, or is that?
Yes, as a dualist is where dual has the word two in it. Dual, D-U-A-L. And it means basically always putting together an argument on the basis of opposites: man, woman, male, female, Christian, Jew, black, white.
So is that binary?
Binary, but it's more. But the term dualism actually comes out of functionalism as a social science, and Talcott Parsons, P-A-R-S-O-N-S, Talcott, it's like Talcott, but anyway, Talcott Parsons, very famous functionalist, in fact, the so-called father of functionalism, came up with this, and so he would never use the word binary. he would use dualism, because for him, the binary, well, to put it more positively, for him, dualism is the expression of the whole. So, you know, if you take this and you cut it in half exactly, then you have dual positions that are exactly the same. So in dialectics, thesis, antithesis, the same thing. But if you cut it so that you just had a little piece coming off, it'd still be dualist. It's just that you take the whole thing, and so it's not quite the same thing as a binary in that sense. But there's two things that make up the whole.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think it basically explaining why for Hegel art does not sit in the gap. Art does not constitute this gap that we spoke on earlier. And now he calls it in the intermediary, but it is the same gap, I think. And he says that is because for the Hegelian, the dialectical way of thinking, this gap as such does not exist. There cannot be a gap in a thought that is based on the premise of the gap. So that's what it says.
Which is very important. Does that make any sense to anybody? No, excellent. Samira, do you want to give it a go?
No.
Well, I suppose if you do cut that wall in half and you move it across the gap, then it becomes more than a whole, doesn't it? So it's not everything in it and everything out of it. And that's why I was thinking of the man and the woman in relation to that dualist thing, was that, you know, queer identities can't just exist in the gap, because it means there's no troubling of the gender, the male and the female side of it. So it has to be a troubling of everything, and not everything with the, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. Can you repeat that?
No. The troubling within the gap. So is that like Jesus, but that troubling gender trouble?
The trouble agenda. No, say it again. I'm not sure if everybody got that.
I don't think I got it. No, I suppose if you've got man and woman on side and they're kind of opposites, they're seen as these opposite things, and then what exists in the middle is what is it? It's kind of, it's neither this nor that, but if it's I think it needs to be more than this middle bit, because otherwise the two sides stay exactly the same and they're not troubled. If it's neatly in the middle, nothing changes on either side. But if it operates on both of them, inside and outside, then it becomes more than the intermediary.
Good. Okay. Doing good. We have just a little bit longer to go. Are you okay? Can we jump ahead a little bit, or shall we stay with the dialectic? I mean, there's a lot to cover, and you need to reread this clearly. But I was hoping that we could get to, it's called, I don't know much because I didn't print it all up, but the Lyotard.
What page?
That is on page 68. Well, 60, sorry. It's like 65. I'm going to go further. And what it is that I'd like if we could just kind of get into the question of how this reflexive moment is being dealt with for Lyotard. The gap, the famous gap problem that we've now circled around for about 2 hours. If we take, and I realize this is sounding, if we take, I realize this is sounding simplistic, and I'm sorry about that, but it's going to have to be. It's not good. So if we take the dialectic as meaning, all that there is, thesis, and all that there's not, synthesis, no, sorry, antithesis, taken together creates the whole picture, except we know it doesn't create the whole picture because for that would be good, for A to equal not A, so for everything on this side is A and everything on this side is not A, and they're the same thing, because one just the negative of the other, one just the other side of the other, right? That doesn't tell you anything, so you can't get meaning from it. So what the move is that one of them gets sublated into the other, or you could say this gets sublated into the other like this, and that creates the synthesis, which then, as a synthesis, comes back around and gives meaning or ground to these two sides. So to put it in English or in translatable terms, the thesis is on one side, its not thesis is antithesis is on the other side. Something must be added for you to come up with this thing to know that it's a piece of paper. And it's not the fact that it has material to it. Something has to be added so that the whole picture is there. Otherwise, just this side explaining itself via that side, or that side explaining itself via that side, and you're not going to get anywhere. So the move in dialectics is to be able to what's called sublate the one into the other, and together it creates the synthesis, which then is able, because of the synthesis, so that this side and this side create something, that then that something that's created gives this whole entity meaning. So that's why it becomes the ground, because it gives both sides meaning, and it becomes a fully constituted concept. Now, to do this, you have all that's on one side and all that's the other. So this gap, this thing called the excluded middle, this excluded middle thing, which can never be crossed, because obviously this will never be on that side, etc., except when you start dealing with the Mobius strip or one-dimensional things where you can actually tear it off and turn it a certain way, and then you can draw on both sides. So technically, in 3 dimensions, this side and this side can never be there. So in the real world, goes the argument, the gap is always there. And what Lyotard, what Kant, what Hegel, what the move of the dialectic does is it says, in order to consolidate this gap, there has to be a reflection. There has to be a way in which it comes back around, that it is a reflection onto the entity, so that you have this self-reflexive or fully reflexive or something to do with the reflection. So in the next chapter, he's talking about this relationship between how something is getting a move in order, either it's an imminent move, I'll explain that in a minute, but this notion of the movement itself as something that is always becoming or always involved, it always designates the always becoming or the always to come, this movement. So this side and this side create the synthesis gives the ground. We can just sort of envision it as it's going around, but it actually doesn't move, it doesn't literally move anywhere. It's like the rings of a tree, I've often said, you know, so we have, it's a terrible crown. You have a tree trunk, and if you looked at the tree trunk like that, so sort of down onto the tree trunk, these rings could not be pulled out. So you wouldn't be saying, when I talk about movement, I'm not saying that they're in and of themselves in different spaces all around the place. They are right there, you're not going anywhere. So even though you have this side and this side taken together creates the whole picture, it doesn't give you any meaning to the picture until there's a way in which that can express something, and that something then gives impetus to these two sides. That's the basic position. That impetus is called a reflection, a reflexive move. It's coming back around. It goes like so. It creates, so that in the thing that I was asking you to take a look at just now, he's criticizing this kind of obsession with having this self-reflexive moment going on. And this is what, yeah?
I want to say something later.
So what he's getting at here is how something, both it makes sense to have an entity do a self-reflexive move, and at the same time, is there a way of breaking that apart so that you can get more out of that move? That's what he's doing in this chapter, or this little bit here. Now, if that didn't make any sense, I'm sure it didn't, but, Mattia?
No, it makes sense, but because ultimately they move. The visualization of the circles of a tree is quite useful because the egg grows like that, and then in the end there is the spirit that is the ultimate self-reflection that keeps it all together. Right?
The spirit of what?
Spirit of the moving of the world that becomes self-conscious. So all history becomes like it is
A tree.
arrival,
And we're back to loving the tree.
this arrival to the Prussian state that is the perfect realization in historical terms of
Yeah.
the self-consciousness, where everything
Find
is
the
in place
flaw.
and there is a place for everything. But there is a lot of critique about these exactly, precisely on the way Hegel has to write it, because he keeps adding preface, introduction, prefaces, because it
Don't
always
look at
needs,
Mark when you say that, because he's
but it needs always an outside place to operate that reflection. Or just not that word, but to operate the reflection. So
I'm going to put it in, let's say, gay liberation terms, because that might make some sort of clearer sense, historically speaking. So it's going to be an anthropologically, historically rooted remark. In the olden days, called the 70s, there was, when I was a child, there was this thing called Stonewall. And Stonewall wasn't the birth of the whole movement, but is often seen as one of the starts, one of the events. And so, as the narrative goes, there were a bunch of drag, depends on which narrative you read, but basically there was a bunch of drag queens that went into a donut shop in Stonewall, in New York, Stonewall, New York, which is why it's called Stonewall. And they ordered some donuts, and some bikers were there. And the bikers didn't like the drag queens, so they started throwing the donuts at the drag queens, and there became a food fight. And then who came in and saved the day were the lesbians, which I love the story, but it always gets left out in the tell. Anyway, and the real bikers then came in, which were the lesbian bikers, you know, and you can imagine how they just put away the other bikers. And from there on grew gay and lesbian movement, or anyway, let's say lesbian and homosexual movement, where both parties decided to throw off the yoke of lesbian and homosexual and become this thing called gay, and therewith became a huge battle on what does it mean to be gay, what does it mean to be straight. And there's a part of the movement that argued that being gay had nothing to do with being straight. It wasn't the opposite of straight, it had nothing to do with straight. You know, people who were gay could be whatever they wanted to be, but gay was also something. Now, if you have that view, let's say, and we're trying to talk about this, then the notion of doing something that is not against something, but actually for something else that has yet to be invented, is what Lyotard is trying to get at here. He's trying to talk about how the self-reflexiveness of something often creates its self-sealing ability to show up identities in this case. So that there's nothing anti in the word gay. It wasn't against straight in a sense. But okay, that got lost in the shuffle of politics, and hence emerged queer as a term. And queer, once again, was raised by the lesbians, but again, we're moved out of history. This is my own little pet peeve. Okay, and that word queer, actually in England, I find interesting. When I came over to England, I was thinking everybody would realize how the lesbians had created queer. No, once again, queer was associated with gay male. I was like totally amazed by this. Just aside. But be that as it may, queer was then taken on politically as an in-between. Or anyway, as something that wasn't set in stone, whatever that was.
It was an anti-identity identity.
It was an anti-identity identity. So this way, it became something that was sort of positive. I mean, positive in the sense that it had something that wasn't now trying to be against this, against that. It was for itself, right? And that did not require this self-reflexive thing. The problem is that in the political move that goes on, there are so many, let's say, tropes to it that require the reflexivity, so that there is meaning to being male or meaning to being female in this very strict, or meaning to being trans, for example, which I think Barnaby, you were talking about, the way in which, you know, certain essentialist characteristics are put forward as a feature of being a trans man, male to female, no, female to male, or male to female, so on and so forth. So again, an essentialism crept back in. And the essentialism is part and parcel of this notion of the substance or the spirit, this interiority of something. What does it really mean to be male? Or what is real? The argument for a very long time was that being male meant that you could do math, that you were logical, that you got angry at certain things, and that you were capable of doing many things at one time. That was a bit more or less this, and could read maps. Okay, that's basically the male thing. And the female was more or less not that. The female was somebody who could not read maps, who was totally hyper, crying every 5 minutes and so on, so hysterical, and so on and so forth. And at the same time was the vamp and sexual. And they had all these different, categories. And so the question is, where did you steal? What did you take to create the different things? How does one break that off? How does one break that away?
Would it
That
would be more.
That was
more,
my.
That was a wrap.
That. Thank you.
more interesting, more useful to speak of points of tangency rather than gaps,
It might be more useful, yes.
because there are all these incommensurable parabolas going in various directions.
But
And then they're irreducible, therefore at times they are tangent or intersect.
okay, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was just thinking, why are we talking about the gaps instead of the thickness is what we.
Because we haven't gotten that far yet, which is not a good reason. So why don't you say something about thickness?
Well, it's, thickness gets to
The thickness of identity.
Well, thickness in relation to difference. So that's how those two go together. So, I don't quite without.
Okay,
sort of
so
pinpointing
we'll just
one
put thickness
particular
on the
point.
table.
Yeah, just sort of.
What
I
is
suppose
thickness?
Well, I think. Oh no!
It's not thin. No, wrong.
Thickness is difference.
Yeah,
Thickness
I think
is difference.
I think it is.
Is thickness stuff with history?
Well, I wouldn't think so.
Stuffed.
Stuff with
Film.
But
no,
not,
stuff.
not with linear history,
stuff
with
that
some
has
kind of
history.
alpha history.
Yeah. Well, probably.
And why do you think that thickness
Is difference.
is difference? Why isn't
Well,
thickness identity?
for instance, all the books on this table are kind of identical
And
insofar
thick.
as they are books, but they are different in their thickness.
Okay.
Thickness is that
Being there to it being there, wasn't it?
That's right.
I think that's how you bring some kind of sensuality to an object. thickness is also the same, I think, as the timbre.
Okay. That's possible.
No, you
No,
know,
that's very true, but you're not, I'm trying to get you to think analytically and not
I would
descriptively.
think thickness. Firstly, he speaks about thickness in the discourse, not thickness in general. So it's thickness of language. And the fact that it says thickness in the discourse, the way I understood it is that he's saying language is not something that is abstract and transparent and is speaking of something else, but it has internal dimensions. In this sense, it is thick.
Can I ask you this then? Is the word "the" thicker or thinner than the word "asshole"?
I don't believe we can put it like that.
No?
No, because or better, it can be asked if only from inside the relationship they are in. Not in abstract, and not from outside.
Yeah, it's possible. No one wants to take a part of it?
Good question, isn't it?
Well, because obviously then he goes, the second part or the second layer is I think there is this other current of psychoanalysis cut into it, which.
Don't go there yet, we haven't
No,
gotten
but
off
I have
page
problems with it,
40
I just
yet.
don't get us, don't agree, so.
Oh,
The is thicker.
Cool. Can I go?
you can go, you have to
I'm
catch your
gonna-
train.
I'm going to disagree. I'm going to say there is thinner.
Hold on one second.
Or the opposite. Asshole is thicker.
It's thicker than the,
Yeah.
okay.
Do you want to go first? You said the opposite.
Yeah.
Promise you I won't just contradict everything you say. Offer the antithesis.
Well, I think it's because the can have many more meanings in many more situations, and while asshole is thinner because it has much. It can take on less, let's say, flavors, or.
But it is sensuous.
I'm gonna disagree for almost the same reason, so I'm gonna offer the antithesis. I think that the is thinner because it offers the definite article, and as such it is almost the most fascistic word in the English language. Arsehole or asshole is, although ostensibly is just a noun. I think it has a certain fluidity of meaning. Sometimes it's an adjective, so it's already starting to move fluidly across grammatical classes.
Yeah,
And I think that fluidity, that offering itself out to heterogeneity, that makes it thicker.
Okay, we're going to end on this. Sorry. Unless it's a burning question.
Just either the thinner, the more power. So if the article is the starting point, that is the thinnest point, the almost of the language,
hilarious.
and organizes the rest. But we can start from the opposite end and start from muscle and organize the whole structure from there.
So,
Or no
which,
structure,
so you
right?
like to be in the that category or the asshole category?
Both.
Okay. Anyway, shall we continue this for next week then?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good.
Very much. Oh, all those that did not receive the invitation to the email group, please hang about. We will do it.
And for those of you that are coming from London and actually taking the train, some of you come.
Join us.
What?
Barnaby can join us.
Okay, Barnaby can drive you.
No, I'll be on the train.
No, but what I was going to say is that sometimes you get, sometimes you can come in earlier and you might want to meet up with each other or whatever, you know.
How's the train?
It's very good. It's a bit, makes me a bit seasick because
Does
it
it?
does sway and go very fast.
Is it a pendulum or something?
Yeah, it's okay. But
Anyway, I'm good with seasickness.
Yeah.
That's fine with me.
it's okay. It's pretty quick. It's pretty quick.